Hey friend, this is Robert Tell. I hope you all are doing well. In these channels, we mostly create the fan fiction kind of story where small changes can rewrite the whole story. If you enjoy this kind of stories, then must subscribe the channels for new upcoming video. Now let's start the chapter.
Greetings and welcome. You've arrived at Hogwarts Tales. We're proud to present today's story. What if Harry left the Dursleys at age 8 and used magic to become the youngest billionaire in London? Enjoying our channel? Subscribe and hit the notification bell. Leave a like and comment to let us know you care. Without any more delay, here's the story. Chapter 1. The boy who ran the cupboard smelled like dust and shoe polish and something Harry had stopped being able to name around age 6. It just smelled like dark. Like the close, stale air that filled your lungs when you breathed too shallow for too long and forgot there was any other way to breathe. He lay on the thin mattress with his knees pulled to his chest because he'd grown again and the cupboard hadn't. 3 days. It had been 3 days since Vernon shoved him in and turned the lock. He'd been keeping count by the strips of light that crawled under the door, brightened, and died. 3 strips meant 3 days. His stomach had passed through pain into something quieter and worse, a kind of hollow ringing that made his thoughts go slow and watery. He could hear them through the door. The television. Dudley laughing at something. Aunt Petunia's heels clicking on the kitchen tile. The sounds of a normal evening in a normal house, and the sounds meant nothing to him except that they were out there and he was in here, and that was how it had always been and how it would always be. Except tonight something was different. He didn't know what had changed. Maybe it was the 3 days. Maybe it was the thing Vernon had said before he'd shoved him in. You're lucky we keep you at all, boy. Lucky we don't dump you at the orphanage where freaks like you belong. Maybe it was the way Aunt Petunia had looked away when he'd said it, not with guilt but with the blank expression of someone watching a mildly unpleasant scene on television. Something she'd rather not see but couldn't be bothered to change the channel over. Harry lay in the dark and felt something move inside his chest. Not break. He'd felt things break before, the small, quiet snapping of hope, of trust, of the belief that if he was just good enough, just quiet enough, just invisible enough, they might eventually love him. Those things had broken years ago. He barely remembered the sound they'd made. This was different. This was something clicking into place. Like a bone that had been out of joint for years finally settling back into its socket. It hurt, but it was the kind of hurt that meant something was finally right. He looked at the lock on the cupboard door. He'd done things before. Things he couldn't explain and the Dursleys refused to acknowledge. He'd turned a teacher's wig blue once, when she'd humiliated him in front of the class for having shabby clothes. He'd ended up on the school roof when Dudley and his gang had chased him across the playground, and he still didn't know how. Once, when Aunt Petunia had shaved his head to stubble because she couldn't stand the mess of it, his hair had grown back overnight, every strand of it, exactly as unruly as before. He'd always been afraid of these things. They were the reason the Dursleys hated him. The freak things. The things that proved he was wrong, broken, other. He looked at the lock and he wasn't afraid. Open, he thought. Not a wish. Not a prayer. A command. Something in his chest, the thing that had clicked into place, pushed, and the lock turned with a sound like a knuckle cracking, and the cupboard door swung open into the hallway light. Harry sat up slowly. His head swam from 3 days of no food. He could hear the television from the living room, some game show, canned applause, and Vernon's thick breathing in the armchair. Petunia was in the kitchen. Dudley was upstairs, the ceiling creaked under his weight. Harry stood. His legs shook. He was small for 8, the smallest in his year at school, and he knew why. You didn't grow right when you ate what a dog might turn down and slept in a space meant for coats. He put his hand against the wall to steady himself and breathed. He had nothing to pack. He owned nothing worth taking. The clothes on his back were Dudley's cast-offs, enormous on his frame, held up with a bit of string. His glasses were cracked and taped at the bridge. He had no money, no plan, no idea where he would go. He walked to the front door. His hand touched the knob, and he felt it, a pull, like a hook behind his navel, urging him back. Stay. Endure. Wait. This is where you belong. He didn't know if it was fear or something else, some invisible thing tied to the house itself, but it didn't matter. He turned the knob and the pull snapped like a thread, and the summer night air hit his face warm and soft and enormous. Harry Potter walked out of number 4, Privet Drive. He didn't look back. The last bus from Little Whinging to London left at 9:30. Harry knew this because he'd memorized the bus schedule 2 years ago, standing at the stop on his way back from school, staring at the timetable with the quiet intensity of someone planning a prison break. He hadn't been planning anything then. He just wanted to know it was possible. He reached the stop with 7 minutes to spare. The driver barely glanced at him. Harry had learned years ago that if he concentrated, really focused on the idea of being unnoticed, people's eyes would slide right past him like he was part of the scenery. It was one of the freak things. Tonight he leaned into it hard, and the driver looked through him as if he were made of glass. He found a seat at the back. The bus was nearly empty, a tired-looking woman with shopping bags, an old man asleep against the window, 2 teenagers sharing earphones and nodding to music Harry couldn't hear. Normal people living normal lives. Harry pressed his forehead against the cool glass and watched Little Whinging shrink and vanish behind him. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel brave. He felt terrified in a way that was somehow cleaner than the fear he'd lived with for years. This was fear of the unknown, the vast open future with no cupboard walls to contain it. The old fear had been worse, the certainty that nothing would ever change, that the walls would just keep getting closer until they crushed him. London swallowed the bus at Hammersmith and didn't spit it out until Victoria Coach Station, where Harry stepped onto a pavement still warm from the July sun and stood very still in the crush of people and noise and light. He had no money. No food. No place to sleep. He had himself. Whatever that was worth. He started walking. The first night was education through suffering. London after dark was nothing like the postcards. It was doorways that stank of urine, gutters running with things he didn't want to identify, and shadows that moved in ways shadows shouldn't. Harry found a spot behind a skip in an alley off the Strand, wedged himself between the wall and a stack of pallets, and tried to sleep. The concrete was still warm. Small mercies. He woke at 2 a.m. to fingers going through his pockets. The hands were quick and practiced, belonging to a boy maybe 12 or 13, spotty and sharp-eyed and utterly unsurprised to find another kid sleeping rough. Nothing on him, the boy muttered to someone behind him. Told you. Look at him. Fresh out. Harry lay very still. There were 2 of them. The second was bigger, 14, maybe 15, with the hard face of someone who'd stopped being a child long before his body agreed. Nice glasses though, the bigger one said. Give us your glasses, mate. Harry looked at him. The thing in his chest, the thing that had opened the lock, stirred. Not rage, exactly. Something colder and more precise. No, Harry said. The bigger boy leaned down. Wasn't asking. Harry felt the push happen before he chose it. The air between them thickened like heat haze, and the boy rocked backward as if he'd walked into a wall of warm air. He stumbled, caught himself, stared. What the? Harry sat up. He was shaking, but he kept his voice flat. Walk away. Something in his tone, or in the air, or in the strange pressure that was still radiating off him like body heat, made both boys take a step back. The bigger one's expression cycled through confusion and anger and landed on something that looked, improbably, like respect. Little nutter, he said, but he was already turning. Come on. He's got nothing anyway. They vanished into the dark. Harry sat with his back against the wall, heart hammering, and thought, I can do things. And I need to learn to do them on purpose. He didn't sleep again that night. Dawn turned the sky over London the color of a bruise, and Harry walked east. He had no destination, but walking was better than sitting and waiting for hunger to make him stupid. He'd gone without food before, 3 days was his record, and he was already there, but he'd always known that eventually Aunt Petunia would slide a piece of bread and a glass of water through the cupboard door. That safety net was gone now. He'd cut it himself. The city smelled different in the morning. Coffee and exhaust and bread from bakeries opening their doors. The bread smell was the worst. It found him at every corner, reached into his stomach and twisted. He stopped in front of a cafe where a woman was setting out chairs on the pavement. She had kind eyes and flour on her apron, and she was close enough that Harry could have reached through the open door and grabbed a croissant from the basket on the counter. He didn't. Not because he was above stealing. He wasn't above anything right now. But because he was thinking, really thinking, with the focused clarity that hunger sometimes gave him, about what came next. Stealing food would feed him today. He needed to find a way to feed himself tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. He needed a system. Harry walked on and found one. It started with a coin. He was crossing Trafalgar Square, weaving between tourists and pigeons, when he felt it, a tiny pull, like a thread tugging behind his breastbone. He stopped. Looked down. There was nothing on the pavement but gum stains and a crushed cigarette. But the pull was insistent, directional, pointing him toward the base of one of the lion statues. He followed it. Knelt at the base of the plinth and found, wedged between the stone and the pavement, a 50-pence piece. It was dirty and half-buried and completely invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Harry held it in his palm and felt the pull again. Different direction. Stronger. He followed it to a storm drain near the National Gallery, where 3-pound coins and a crumpled 5-pound note had washed against the grate. Then to a bench in St. James's Park, where a 20-pound note had slipped between the slats and been pressed flat by rain. By noon he had 47 pounds and a theory. He could find things. Lost things. Hidden things. Things that had slipped through cracks and been forgotten. It was like the unnoticing, like the push, it was one of his abilities. But this one wasn't defensive. This one was useful. He bought a sandwich from a pret-a-manger and ate it sitting on the steps of St. Martin in the Fields, and it was the best thing he had ever tasted. Not because of the food, it was a mediocre cheese and pickle, but because he had found the money and earned the meal and no one had given him permission. He finished eating and kept hunting. The finding ability, he didn't know what else to call it, grew sharper with practice, like a muscle being used for the first time. By the end of his second day in London, he could sense lost things from 50 meters. Coins, mostly. A tourist's dropped wallet near Buckingham Palace, he returned it for a 10-pound reward. A woman's engagement ring that had slipped off her finger into the grass at Green Park, she cried and gave him 20 pounds and he almost cried too, though he didn't know why. But it wasn't just objects. Sometimes the pull led him to places, a quiet courtyard behind a row of shops where no one ever went, perfect for sleeping. A public library in Westminster where the staff didn't ask questions and the radiators actually worked. A church hall in Southwark that gave out free meals on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, no questions asked. London was full of hidden things, and Harry was learning to read it like a book written in a language only he could see. By the end of his first week, he had a routine. Mornings were for finding coins, lost property, anything he could return for a reward. Afternoons were for the library, where he read voraciously, the Financial Times, property listings, business magazines, anything that explained how money moved through the world. He read the way a starving person eats, desperately, indiscriminately, absorbing everything. Evenings were for exploring, mapping the city in his head, learning which neighborhoods were safe and which weren't, which doorways were sheltered from rain, which skips behind which restaurants had the best discarded food. He was surviving. But surviving wasn't enough. Harry had spent 8 years surviving. He wanted something else, something he couldn't quite name yet but could feel the shape of, like a word on the tip of his tongue. He wanted to never be powerless again. It was a Thursday evening, 10 days after he'd left Privet Drive, and Harry was at the church hall in Southwark eating lentil soup when a girl sat down across from him and said, "You're the finder." She was maybe 12, with a sharp face and dark eyes and hair cut bluntly at the jaw like she'd done it herself with kitchen scissors. She was wearing a jacket 2 sizes too big over a faded red t-shirt that said Chen's Palace across the front in cracked letters. She was looking at Harry with an expression he'd never seen directed at him before, not pity, not contempt, not the glazed indifference of the Desleys. Interest. Calculation. The way you'd look at a tool you weren't sure you needed yet but weren't about to throw away. "I'm what?" Harry said. "The finder. The little kid who's been pulling coins out of drains all over central London." She dunked bread into her soup and bit off a chunk. "Word gets around when you live on the street. You're not exactly subtle." Harry took a slow breath. He'd been careful, or thought he had. "Who's asking?" "Maggie Chen. And I'm not asking. I'm telling you what I know, which is more than you'd like." She pointed at him with the bread. "You're what, 7? 8? 8. Sleeping rough, no parents, no crew. How long do you think that lasts?" "I'm doing fine." "You're doing lucky. There's a difference, and trust me, the difference kills people." She leaned forward. "I've been out here 2 years. I know everyone under 15 who sleeps rough between Waterloo and King's Cross. I know which coppers will nick you and which ones will buy you chips. I know which shelters are safe and which ones have people who'll hurt you. I know things you need to know and can't learn fast enough on your own." Harry studied her. She was direct in a way that didn't feel like a sales pitch, more like someone stating facts and daring you to be smart enough to listen. He liked it. He'd spent 8 years around people who lied constantly, to him, to each other, to themselves, and the bluntness was like fresh air. "What do you want?" he asked. Because nobody offered something for nothing. That was the first lesson the Desleys had taught him, and the only one worth keeping. Maggie's expression shifted. Just a flicker, there and gone, but Harry caught it. Pain. Old and deep and carefully stored. "I want to know how you do it," she said. "The finding thing. I watched you yesterday at Trafalgar Square. You walked straight to a drain and pulled out coins like you knew they were there. No searching. No guessing. You just knew. Good instincts." "Rubbish. I've got good instincts. What you've got is something else." She held his gaze. "I'm not going to tell anyone. I don't care how weird it is. I just want to understand." Harry looked at her for a long time. He thought about the cupboard. About the lock opening without a touch. About the push that had sent a boy twice his size stumbling backward. About the finding, the unnoticing, all of it. He'd never told anyone. He'd never had anyone to tell. "I can't explain it," he said finally. "I just feel where things are. Lost things. Hidden things. It's like a pull." Maggie nodded slowly. She didn't look shocked or frightened or disgusted. She looked like someone who just had a theory confirmed. "Right," she said. "Then here's what I can offer. I have a network, kids all over central London. We share information, watch each other's backs, pool what we find. You join us, you've got people. Protection. Knowledge of the streets. In exchange, you use your talent to help us find things that are actually worth finding." She paused. "And you teach me what you can about how the money world works. I've seen you in the library, reading the Financial Times like it's a storybook. You're planning something." Harry couldn't help it. He smiled. It felt strange on his face, like a muscle he'd forgotten he had. "You've been watching me." "Of course I've been watching you. You're the most interesting thing that's happened on these streets in months. She extended her hand across the table. Deal? Harry looked at her hand. Small and brown and calloused and steady. He thought about all the reasons to say no. Trust was a liability, people let you down, he worked better alone. All the lessons the cupboard had taught him. He took her hand and shook it. Deal. 2 weeks with Maggie changed everything. Her network was impressive, a loose web of maybe 20 kids between the ages of 9 and 15, spread across central London, connected by routes and routines and a simple code of knocks and chalk marks on walls. They weren't a gang. Maggie was adamant about that. No stealing from people, no violence, no drugs. They were a survival network. They shared food, warned each other about dangerous adults, passed along information about where to find work, sweeping shops, washing dishes, hauling boxes at markets. Harry plugged into this network like a battery into a circuit. His finding ability, stronger now, reaching further every day, made him invaluable. He found a cash box a shopkeeper had lost behind a false panel in his store. He found a teenager's missing dog, 3 miles from where it had run away, cowering under a railway arch. He found a leak in a water main that was about to flood a basement where 4 kids were sleeping. Each find earned goodwill, favors, or money, and Harry kept careful track of all of it in a notebook he'd bought from a pound shop. You keep accounts, Maggie said one evening, watching him note down the day's finds and expenses in his cramped, precise handwriting. They were in the library, their library, the one in Westminster where the staff had stopped asking questions. Harry had a table near the radiator that he thought of as his office. Like a proper businessman. If you don't know where the money goes, you don't have money, Harry said. You just have coins falling through your fingers. Where'd you learn that? The Financial Times? Common sense. He finished his entry and closed the notebook. Maggie, how much do you know about property? She gave him a look. I'm 12 and homeless. What do you think? I think you're 12 and smarter than most adults I've met, which isn't hard because most adults are idiots, but still. He pulled a newspaper from his bag, a copy of the Evening Standard, folded to the property section. There are buildings all over London sitting empty. Owned by companies that forgot about them, or tied up in legal disputes, or just abandoned. Some of them are worth millions. So someone who could find those buildings, figure out who owned them, and buy them cheaply could make a lot of money. Maggie stared at him. You're 8 years old. I know how old I am. You're 8 years old and you want to buy buildings. Not yet. I can't buy anything yet. I need capital, I need a legal identity, and I need someone who understands the law. He tapped the newspaper. But I can start looking. And when I'm ready, I'll know exactly where to go. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You're either going to end up running this city or in prison. I'd prefer the first option. Yeah, she said. Me too. Show me the listings. They spent the evening going through the property section together, and Harry explained what he'd been learning about markets and valuations and how money moved through the city's veins like blood. Maggie listened the way he'd seen her listen to everything, hungrily, critically, filing every piece of information into a mental architecture that was probably as detailed as his own. She asked sharp questions. She poked holes in his reasoning. She told him when he was being an idiot. Nobody had ever done that for him before, and it was, he realized with something close to wonder, exactly what he needed. It was a month after his escape, early August, the city sweltering, the pavement so hot it shimmered, when the finding led him somewhere that changed everything. He was walking through Clerkenwell, a neighborhood in transition. Old warehouses and workshops were being gutted and converted into offices and flats. Scaffolding climbed the faces of Victorian buildings like ivy made of steel. Harry liked this area because it felt like possibility, a place becoming something new. The pull hit him crossing a side street. Stronger than anything he'd felt before, not a thread but a rope, yanking at something behind his sternum, almost painful in its urgency. He stopped. Turned. Looked at a building at the end of the street. It was a narrow Victorian terrace, 4 stories, boarded up. The brickwork was dark with age and the windows were blanked with sheets of plywood and graffiti. A faded sign on the door read Hargrove Properties, No entry, trespassers will be prosecuted. Harry stood on the pavement and felt the pulse singing through him like a plucked string. Something was in there. Something old and significant, hidden so long it had almost been forgotten. He walked around the back. Found a basement window where the plywood had rotted through. The unnoticing settled over him like a cloak. A passing woman looked right at him and her eyes slid away, and he squeezed through the gap and dropped into the darkness below. The basement was large and empty, thick with dust and the smell of damp stone. Harry's eyes adjusted quickly, they always had, all those years in the cupboard, and he moved through the space following the pull. It led him to the far wall, where the brickwork was older than the rest, darker, hand-laid in a pattern that spoke of a different century. He put his hand against the wall and pushed. Not physically. The other push. The one from his chest. The bricks shuddered. Dust rained down. And a section of wall, maybe 3 feet square, ground inward and to the side, revealing a cavity behind it. Harry's breath caught. The space behind the false wall was small, barely a closet, and its contents were covered in a century of dust. But the pull was screaming now, and Harry's hands found what it wanted him to find. A strongbox. Iron, Victorian era, heavy as sin. The lock was rusted shut, but that was no obstacle. Harry looked at it and it clicked open as if it had been waiting for him. Inside, gold sovereigns. Dozens of them, loose, glinting dull yellow under the dust. And beneath the coins, folded and brittle, documents. Bearer bonds, printed on heavy paper that crackled when he touched it. He couldn't read them in the dark, but he could feel their weight, not physical weight, though they had that too. The weight of potential. Harry sat on the basement floor with a fortune in his lap and did something he rarely did. He thought about right and wrong. The building belonged to Hargrove Properties. The sign on the door said so. Which meant, legally, whatever was inside the building belonged to them too. The gold, the bonds, all of it. Whoever had bricked them up behind this wall, some Victorian miser, some merchant hiding assets from creditors, was long dead, and their hidden treasure was now the property of whatever company owned the land. Harry could feel this truth settling in his chest, clear and uncomfortable. He thought about the Dursleys. About Dudley's 2 bedrooms full of toys. About the cupboard under the stairs. About the 3 days without food. About all the things that had been taken from him, not just meals and space and light, but the basic certainty that he mattered, that his existence wasn't an inconvenience to be minimized. He thought about Hargrove Properties, whoever they were. A company rich enough to own buildings and let them rot. A name on a sign. A legal entity that would never notice this loss, might never even know this treasure existed. He thought about Maggie and the kids in her network, sleeping in doorways, eating from church halls, invisible. Harry closed the strongbox. Wrapped it in his jacket. Carried it out through the basement window. He didn't feel guilty. He felt like someone who'd made a decision and intended to live with it. The sovereigns were worth more than he'd expected. A gold dealer near Hatton Garden, a dry, meticulous man who didn't ask where an 8-year-old had come by a bag of Victorian coins, gave him a fair price. Harry knew it was fair because he'd spent 2 days researching gold values at the library before walking through the door. He didn't let the dealer see all the coins at once. He sold them in batches, over several visits, always wearing different clothes, never giving the same name. The bearer bonds were trickier. They were Victorian era, issued by a bank that no longer existed, and Harry couldn't cash them himself. He put them in a safe deposit box he rented under a false name at a Barclays branch where the clerk barely looked at him through the haze of the unnoticing. Total value from the sovereigns, just under £2,000. It was nothing. A rounding error. The kind of money that adults stepped over on their way to real money. But Harry had grown up with nothing, and £2,000 felt like the key to a door he'd been pressing against his whole life. He told Maggie. She listened without interrupting. She'd learned that when Harry had something to say, the fastest way through it was silence, and when he finished, she asked only one question. The building. It belonged to someone. Hargrove Properties. And you took it anyway. Yes. She looked at him for a long time. Her expression was unreadable. Then she nodded, once, and said, "What's the plan?" The plan required one more piece, and Harry found it under Waterloo Bridge. It was raining the night he found Thomas Ashworth, a thin, persistent London rain that turned the world grey and made the streets shine like wet metal. Harry was cutting through the underpass beneath the bridge, heading for a dry spot he knew about, when the finding pulled at him. Not toward an object this time. Toward a person. The man was huddled against the concrete wall, wrapped in a sleeping bag that had long since lost its waterproofing. He was thin, grey-bearded, with the weather-beaten face of someone who'd been outdoors too long, but his hands were what caught Harry's attention. Long fingers, carefully maintained nails, clean despite everything. Hands that belonged in an office, behind a desk. Hands that remembered a different life. Harry crouched nearby and waited. The man opened one eye. "Sod off," he said. His voice was rough, but the accent was educated. Not posh, not Hargrove Properties posh, but the clear, precise diction of someone who'd spent years choosing words carefully. "I'm not here to rob you," Harry said. "Congratulations." "Still sod off." The man closed his eye. "You're a solicitor," Harry said. Both eyes opened. They were bloodshot but sharp, sharper than they had any right to be, given the empty bottle poking out of the sleeping bag's edge. The man corrected after a long pause. Past tense. Very firmly past tense. What happened? What makes you think I want to discuss my personal history with a child in a rainstorm? Nothing. I'm not asking because I'm curious. I'm asking because I need a solicitor and you need a reason to stop drinking yourself to death. The silence that followed was long enough that Harry could hear individual raindrops hitting the concrete. Then the man laughed. It was a terrible sound, rusty and broken and surprised by its own existence. "Christ," he said. "How old are you?" 8. 8. He sat up slowly, the sleeping bag falling away to reveal a frame that had once been substantial and was now just tall and thin. "I'm being propositioned by an 8-year-old. Under a bridge. In the rain. This is either a very vivid hallucination or the universe has finally developed a sense of humor. My name is Harry. I have £2,000, a plan to make more, and no adult who can sign documents on my behalf. You have legal expertise, no money, and a drinking problem. I think we can help each other." Thomas Ashworth stared at him. Harry watched the calculations happening behind those bloodshot eyes, the assessment, the skepticism, and beneath both, something fragile and desperate that looked a lot like hope trying not to be recognized. "You're serious," Thomas said. "I don't joke. I've never really learned how." "That's rather sad, actually. It's efficient. Will you hear me out?" Another long pause. Rain. The distant rumble of a train on the bridge above. Thomas reached for the bottle beside him. Harry watched. Thomas looked at the bottle. Looked at Harry. Put the bottle down. "Talk," he said. Harry talked. He laid out what he had, the money, the knowledge he'd accumulated from weeks of intensive reading, his ability to find undervalued assets. He didn't explain how he found them, and Thomas, to his credit, didn't ask. He laid out what he needed, a legal adult to sign contracts, register businesses, open proper bank accounts. And he laid out what he was offering in return. "You get clean. Properly clean. I'll help, I'll find meetings, resources, whatever it takes. Once you're sober, you become the legal face of my operation. Salary, a proper place to live, legitimate work. A second chance. And in exchange? In exchange, you do exactly what I say when it comes to the business. You sign where I tell you to sign. You speak where I tell you to speak. You don't ask questions you don't need answers to. That's a rather large amount of trust to ask from a man you found under a bridge. I'm not asking for trust. I'm offering a transaction. Trust comes later, if it comes at all. Thomas was quiet for a very long time. When he spoke, his voice had lost its roughness. It was careful and clear and carried the ghost of the man he'd been. I was a solicitor for 22 years. Commercial property law. I was good, not brilliant, but good. Careful. Thorough. My wife left me in '84. Took our daughter. I started drinking. Lost the practice, lost the flat, lost everything in the order you'd expect. He paused. That's not a plea for sympathy. It's disclosure. If you're going to hire me, you should know what you're getting. I know what I'm getting, Harry said. Someone who understands property law, commercial contracts, and corporate structure. Someone who has nothing left to lose and everything to gain. And someone who's smart enough to know that this is the best offer he's going to get. Thomas looked at the bottle again. This time he picked it up. Harry's stomach dropped. Thomas poured the remaining whiskey onto the concrete. It pooled and ran toward the gutter, catching the light from a distant street lamp. When do we start? He said. Getting Thomas clean was the hardest thing Harry had done since leaving Privet Drive. Harder than sleeping rough, harder than going hungry, harder than any of it. Withdrawal was ugly, 3 days of shaking and sweating and vomiting in the basement space Harry had found for them, a disused storage room beneath a defunct print shop in Bermondsey. Harry stayed with him through all of it, bringing water, cleaning up, sitting in the dark listening to a grown man cry. Maggie helped. She found an AA meeting in Lambeth and physically walked Thomas to the door. She sourced clean clothes from charity shops. She bullied a sympathetic doctor at a free clinic into giving Thomas a checkup and prescribing vitamins. She did all of this with the efficient ferocity of someone who understood that helping people sometimes meant dragging them forward when they wanted to stop. After 2 weeks, Thomas could stand without shaking. After 3, his eyes were clear. After 4, he looked at Harry across the makeshift table in their basement and said, I'd like to see this plan of yours in detail. Harry spread the map on the table. He'd been working on it for weeks, a map of London marked with colored pins and handwritten notes. Red pins for properties he'd identified as undervalued or abandoned. Blue pins for areas his instincts, the finding, extended to its fullest range, reaching for opportunity like a compass needle seeking north, told him would increase in value. Green pins for potential allies, shopkeepers who'd been helpful, building managers who might be bribable, council officials whose public statements suggested they were planning development projects. Thomas studied the map in silence for 10 minutes. This is extraordinary, he said quietly. Some of these assessments, the Docklands predictions, the transport corridor analysis, I've seen professional surveyors get this wrong. How did you? I told you. Don't ask questions you don't need answers to. Thomas met his eyes. There was something new in his expression, not just gratitude or self-interest, but genuine respect. Fair enough. Then let me tell you what I see. I see a workable strategy for building a property portfolio, if, and this is a significant if, you can maintain your analytical accuracy. The seed money is small but sufficient for a first purchase if we target the right asset. We'll need a corporate structure, a limited company, properly registered. I can set that up. Blackstone Holdings, Harry said. You've already named it. I named it the first night. Under the bridge, while you were sleeping. Thomas shook his head slowly. You are, without question, the most unsettling child I have ever encountered. Thank you. It wasn't a compliment. But he was almost smiling. They worked through the night. Thomas explained corporate law, company formation, fiduciary duties, contract structures, the skeleton of the business world that Harry had been reading about in newspapers but had never had translated into practice. Harry absorbed it like desert soil absorbing rain. He asked precise questions. He challenged assumptions. Twice, he corrected Thomas on points of current regulation that had changed since Thomas's practice days. By dawn, they had a plan. Blackstone Holdings would be registered as a limited company with Thomas as sole director and shareholder, on paper. Harry would be the invisible architect, identifying targets, directing strategy, making decisions. Their first acquisition would be small, a single undervalued property, purchased cheaply, improved, and resold or leased at a profit. The proceeds would fund the next acquisition, and the next. "It'll take years," Thomas said. "I've got years," Harry said. "I'm 8. Maggie arrived with breakfast, sausage rolls from a bakery that sold yesterday's stock at half price, and found them hunched over the map like generals planning a campaign. "You two look mental," she said cheerfully. "Have you slept?" "Sleep is for people who aren't building empires," Harry said. "Sleep is for people who want to live past 30. Eat your sausage roll." She sat down and looked at the map. "What's the green pin in Lambeth?" "Potential development site. The council's planning a new community center, which means the land around it goes up in value because people want to live near nice things." "I'm not thick, Harry. I'm asking about that specific pin because that's the block where Karen and the twins are sleeping, and if you're planning to buy it, I need to know they've got somewhere to go." Harry stopped. He looked at the pin. He looked at Maggie. Her expression was set, jaw firm, eyes steady, not angry but absolutely immovable. "I won't buy anything that displaces people without rehoming them first," he said. "That's a rule." "Good. Write it down." He wrote it down. Their basement headquarters took shape over the following weeks. Harry used his abilities carefully, warming the space in the evenings, sealing cracks where rain got in, encouraging a gas lamp that should have been dead to burn steady and bright. He didn't think about what he was doing in any organized way. It was instinct, the same instinct that had opened the cupboard lock. He reached for what he needed and the world bent, slightly, to accommodate him. But the world didn't always bend smoothly. There were nights when Harry woke from nightmares so vivid he could feel Vernon's hand on his collar, and his abilities erupted uncontrolled. Light bulbs exploded. Cracks appeared in walls. Once, every piece of metal in the room, nails, coins, the hinges on the door, vibrated with a high, thin whine that lasted 30 seconds and left Harry gasping on his mattress with a nosebleed soaking his pillow. He learned to manage it. Breathe. Focus. Pull the energy back in. It was like clenching a muscle he hadn't known he had, exhausting at first, then gradually easier. But the nightmares didn't stop, and the energy didn't diminish. If anything, it was growing. One evening in late September, Harry was alone in the basement, reviewing property listings by lamplight, when the finding pulled at him in a way it never had before. Not towards something lost. Towards something wrong. He'd been aware of it for weeks, at the edges of his perception, a dissonance, like a note played slightly off-key in a symphony too vast to hear in full. It was loudest underground, in the tube stations and the tunnels beneath the city. A vibration. A presence. Something enormous and patient and very, very old. Tonight it was closer. Harry put down his listings and stood. The lamp flickered. The temperature in the room dropped, not dramatically, but enough that his breath showed in the air for a moment before the cold retreated. He walked to the wall, the old wall, the one that had been there since the building was built, maybe before. He put his hand against the brick and felt it, a pulse. Deep and slow, like a heartbeat measured in centuries. The brick was warm under his palm. Warmer than it should have been. And for a moment, just a flash, so quick he might have imagined it, he saw something behind his eyes. A river of light beneath the streets. Channels and veins of something that wasn't electricity and wasn't water but behaved like both, flowing through the bedrock of London in patterns that were too regular to be natural and too vast to be human-made. And at the junctions, where the channels converged, nodes of concentrated energy that pulsed and hummed and remembered. He pulled his hand away. The vision vanished. The lamp steadied. The room was warm again. Harry stood very still for a long time. He thought about the things he could do, the finding, the unnoticing, the push, the lock opening, the way he could warm a room or mend a crack or make a lamp burn. He thought about the energy he could feel flowing beneath the city, vast and ancient and indifferent. And he thought about the question he'd been avoiding since the night he'd walked out of the cupboard. What am I? He didn't have an answer. Not yet. But the question had changed shape. It wasn't frightened anymore. It was curious. He went back to his listings. October came in grey and wet. Thomas, clean for 2 months now, filed the paperwork for Blackstone Holdings Limited. Harry watched him walk out of company's house with the registration documents and thought, it's real now. Whatever happens next, it's real. Their first target was a ground-floor commercial unit in Bermondsey, a former shop, empty for 2 years, owned by an elderly landlord who'd lost track of his properties. Thomas, in a suit Maggie had found at a charity shop and Harry had cleaned with a focused thought, presented himself as a buyer and negotiated a price of £1,200. It was worth at least 5 times that, and would be worth 10 times in 2 years when the area developed as Harry's instincts insisted it would. Harry spent a weekend in the empty unit, alone, repairing it. This was where his abilities shone brightest. He could feel the building's problems like aches in his own body. Cracked plaster. Rotting floorboards. A damp course that had failed years ago. He fixed them one by one, not with tools but with concentration and the push. Plaster smoothed. Wood hardened. Damp retreated. It was exhausting. He slept for 14 hours afterward, but when he was done, the unit looked as if it had been professionally renovated. Thomas found a tenant within a week, a small accounting firm, willing to sign a 3-year lease at £400 a month. £400 a month. From a £1,200 investment. Harry wrote the numbers in his notebook and stared at them and felt something unfamiliar and warm bloom in his chest. We need to do this again, he told Thomas. Bigger. We need to be careful, Thomas said. If we grow too fast, we need to grow exactly as fast as we can without making mistakes. There's a difference between careful and slow. I want to be careful. I don't want to be slow. Thomas looked at him with that expression he sometimes wore, somewhere between admiration and concern, like a man watching a fire that was warming his house while fully aware that fire, by nature, consumed whatever it touched. You're going to be remarkable, Thomas said. I just hope I'm still around to see it. You will be, Harry said. That's the plan. And it was. For £2,000 and a plan and 3 people who had nothing and nobody and each other, it was more than enough. The evening was cool and the lamp burned steady and Harry spread his map of London on the table. Thomas sat on his left with a legal pad and a pen. Maggie sat on his right with a sausage roll and a skeptical expression. The basement was warm, Harry's doing, and dry, also Harry's doing, and, for the first time in any of their lives, it felt like home. Right, Harry said, and put his finger on the map. Here's where we start. He was 8 years old. He had £2,000, 2 allies, and a city full of hidden things waiting to be found. Somewhere beneath them, deep in the ancient bedrock of London, something vast and patient stirred in its sleep. And in a castle in Scotland, a silver instrument on an old man's desk spun and clicked and registered, for the first time in 7 years, a reading that made no sense at all. But those were problems for another day. Tonight, Harry Potter was planning. And London had no idea what was coming. Chapter 2, Empire of Glass. The property on Tooley Street was a wreck. 3 stories of Victorian warehouse, the roof half collapsed, the ground floor flooded with 6 inches of brown water that smelled like the Thames had gargled with sewage and spat it back. The estate agent, a harried woman named Sandra who'd clearly drawn the short straw to show this listing, stood at the threshold and gestured vaguely inward with the expression of someone presenting a corpse at a viewing. "As you can see, it needs work," she said. Thomas nodded thoughtfully, hands clasped behind his back, every inch the composed professional in his second charity shop suit. Harry stood behind him, small and silent and utterly ignored, the unnoticing draped over him like a second skin. He didn't need Sandra to see him. He needed to see the building. And he could see it. Not the ruin in front of him, the building underneath the ruin. The bones of it. Good brick, Victorian grade, the kind they didn't make anymore. Load-bearing walls still solid despite decades of neglect. The flooding was surface level, a blocked drain easily fixed. The roof needed replacing, but the timber frame beneath it was oak, hard as iron, barely touched by rot. More than that, he could feel what this street would become. The pull was there, that deep, warm certainty that had guided every good decision he'd made since London. This area was going to transform. He could sense it the way he could sense lost coins and drains, but bigger, vaguer, a tidal pull rather than a specific tug. Something about the river, the proximity to the city, the nascent energy of money looking for somewhere to land. 2 years, maybe 3, and this stretch of Tooley Street would be unrecognizable. "What's the asking price?" Thomas said. 40,000. Sandra paused. "There's some flexibility." Harry caught Thomas's eye and held up 3 fingers, then made a fist. Thomas didn't blink. "We'll offer 30, Thomas said. "Cash. Quick completion." Sandra's eyebrows rose. She looked at the flooded warehouse, at the collapsed roof, at the general air of architectural despair, and clearly wondered what kind of madman paid £30,000 for this. But cash was cash and quick was quick and her commission was her commission. "I'll put it to the seller," she said. They got it for 28. That was November. By December, Harry had spent 3 weekends alone in the warehouse, working through the nights. He couldn't explain to anyone what he did during those sessions, couldn't have explained it to himself, fully, but the results were tangible. He'd stand in a flooded room and push, and the water would retreat, flowing backward through drains that unclogged themselves with wet, organic sounds. He'd put his hands on cracked walls and feel the brick respond, hairline fractures sealing like wounds healing in fast forward. The roof was beyond even his abilities, he couldn't conjure timber from nothing, but he could strengthen what remained, hardening rotted wood until it was denser than the original oak. When a proper roofing crew came in January to replace the missing sections, their foreman stood in the attic space and frowned at the existing timbers. "These are in remarkable condition," he told Thomas. "For a building this age, this is. I've never seen anything like it, honestly. It's like someone treated the wood with something." "Previous owners were very diligent," Thomas said smoothly. "The renovation cost £8,000 in total, mostly the roof and new plumbing, things Harry couldn't fake with willpower alone. The finished building was clean, structurally sound, and attractive enough that Thomas leased it within a month to a design firm relocating from Shoreditch. The lease was worth £6,000 a year. On an investment of £36,000, they were looking at a full return in 6 years, plus a building that was appreciating in value by the month. Harry wrote the numbers in his notebook and felt the warm bloom again. Then he turned the page and started planning the next one. By March of 1989, Blackstone Holdings owned 4 properties. By May, 7. By July, 12. The pattern was always the same. Harry would identify the target using a combination of research, instinct, and the finding. Thomas would negotiate the purchase, leveraging his reborn legal skills and the quiet authority of a man who'd remembered who he was. Harry would fix what he could fix with his abilities. Professional contractors would handle the rest. Tenants would appear. Harry had a knack for matching buildings to businesses, sensing what a space wanted to be with the same certainty he sensed lost objects. The money grew. Not slowly, either. Each property generated rental income that funded the next acquisition, and each acquisition increased Blackstone's portfolio value, which increased its borrowing power, which enabled larger purchases. It was a virtuous cycle, and Harry rode it with the instincts of someone who'd been born to read the currents of capital. But it wasn't just instinct. Harry worked harder than anyone Maggie or Thomas had ever seen. He was in the Westminster Library every morning when it opened, reading company reports, market analyses, planning applications, council minutes, anything that might give him an edge. He'd learned to use the library's microfiche system to research property histories. He'd memorized the names of every major player in London real estate, who owned what, who owed whom, which firms were overextended, which were sitting on undervalued assets. He was 9 years old. He read the Financial Times cover to cover every day. He understood leverage, yield curves, and amortization schedules. He could calculate compound interest in his head. And beneath all of it, powering the machine like a hidden engine, was the magic, the finding, the fixing, the unnoticing, that gave him an advantage no competitor could match or even imagine. "You need to slow down," Thomas said one evening in June. They'd moved out of the Bermondsey basement by then, into a proper office, a ground-floor unit in one of their own buildings, furnished with second-hand desks and filing cabinets. Thomas had a telephone and a Rolodex and a door with Blackstone Holdings stenciled on the glass. Harry had a corner desk that he'd arranged so his back was never to the door, a habit from the cupboard that he suspected he'd never break. "We're not going fast enough," Harry said without looking up from his spreadsheet. "Harry. We've acquired 12 properties in 8 months. We've gone from £2,000 to a portfolio worth," Thomas checked his notes. "Conservatively, 400,000. That's extraordinary by any measure. But we're attracting attention." "From whom?" "Planning committees, for one. We've submitted 7 renovation applications in 6 months, all approved, all moving suspiciously quickly. The Bermondsey Council planning officer asked me last week if I had someone on the inside." Thomas paused. "And I've heard the name Hargrove 3 times this month. Victor Hargrove. His company owns nearly a quarter of the commercial property in southeast London. We've been buying in his territory." Harry looked up. "Tell me about Hargrove." Thomas leaned back. He had the look he got when he was accessing his encyclopedic knowledge of London's business landscape, a resource that was proving almost as valuable as Harry's magic. "Victor Hargrove. 54. Cambridge, then the city, then property. Built Hargrove Properties into one of London's largest commercial landlords over 20 years. Connected, knows people in Parliament, in the Metropolitan Police, on every planning committee south of the river. Charming in person, ruthless in practice. There are stories, unproven, but persistent, about competitors who crossed him and found their planning applications blocked, their financing pulled, their buildings suddenly failing council inspections. Is he the one who owned the Clerkenwell building? The one where I found the strongbox? He owns hundreds of buildings. I'd have to check. Check. Thomas checked. He was. The Clerkenwell Terrace was one of dozens of derelict properties Hargrove had acquired in bulk purchases over the years, buildings bought for the land value, left to rot, held until the area developed enough to justify redevelopment at maximum profit. It was a common strategy among London's property barons. Buy cheap, hold, let other people's investments raise the tide, then build expensive and sell dear. He's patient, Harry said. And he thinks long-term. That makes him dangerous. It makes him successful. There's a difference. Not from where I'm sitting. Harry spent a week researching Hargrove. Not just the public information, the company's house filings, the press coverage, the charity board memberships, but the hidden things. He used the finding, extending it in a way he hadn't tried before, not searching for physical objects, but for connections. Links between people, between companies, between flows of money. It was harder than finding coins. It gave him headaches that lasted hours and nosebleeds that stained his shirts. But it worked. He found the web. Hargrove's legitimate property empire was the visible structure, the part above the waterline. Below it lay a network of shell companies, offshore accounts, and unofficial relationships that painted a very different picture. Planning committee members who'd received gifts. Council officials whose children had mysteriously gained internships at Hargrove-affiliated firms. A police superintendent who'd been given use of a Hargrove-owned flat in Mayfair, rent-free, for 3 years. And something else. Something that made Harry's jaw clench when he found it. A fire. February 1986. A Chinese restaurant in Lambeth, burned to the ground. The official cause was listed as an electrical fault. The insurance had paid out, to the building's owner, Hargrove Properties. The restaurant's operators, a family named Chen, had received nothing. They'd had no contents insurance. They'd lost everything. Harry sat at his desk and stared at the fire report for a very long time. Then he went to find Maggie. She was at the Southwark Church Hall, helping serve the Thursday evening meal. Harry waited until she was done. He'd learned not to interrupt her during what she called her rounds, and pulled her aside in the alley behind the hall. "Your family's restaurant," he said. "In Lambeth." Maggie's face changed. It was like watching a door close, the openness, the sharp humor, the calculating intelligence all retreating behind something flat and hard and private. "What about it?" It was in a Hargrove building. The fire was ruled electrical, but Hargrove's insurance claim was filed 2 days before the fire happened. The claim paperwork is dated the 4th of February. The fire was the 6th. Silence. The sound of traffic on the street. A dog barking somewhere. "That's not possible," Maggie said. Her voice was very controlled. "You can't file an insurance claim for something that hasn't happened yet. You can if you know it's going to happen. If you arranged for it to happen." Maggie leaned against the wall. She was breathing carefully, the way Harry breathed when the nightmares came, controlled, deliberate, holding something enormous in check. "My mum," she said. "My mum was in the kitchen when it started. She got out, but her hands, the burns never healed properly. She couldn't, she stopped. Pressed her palms against her eyes. When she lowered them, her face was dry but her eyes were incandescent. You're telling me that man burned our restaurant on purpose? I'm telling you the paperwork doesn't add up. I can't prove intent, not yet. But the dates are wrong, Maggie. The dates are wrong and Hargrove collected £80,000 on a building he'd been trying to vacate for a year because he wanted to redevelop the whole block. Where's your proof? In a safe deposit box. Copies of the insurance filings, council records, the lot. I found them through my methods. They exist. They're real." Maggie was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice had the quality of a blade being drawn from a sheath, slow, deliberate, and very sharp. "What are you going to do with them?" "I'm going to keep them. For now. Hargrove is too big to fight directly, not yet. We don't have the resources or the credibility. If I release this now, it disappears. He has friends in the police, friends on the council. The evidence gets lost. The story gets buried." Harry held her gaze. "But we're growing. And when we're big enough, when Blackstone has enough weight to make this stick, I'm going to take him apart. Promise me." "I promise. Not a business promise. Not a when it's strategically optimal promise. Promise me like a person, Harry. Like someone who gives a damn." He looked at her, this 12-year-old girl who'd lost her home and her family's livelihood and her mother's hands to a rich man's arson, who'd spent 2 years on the streets and built a network from nothing and never once felt sorry for herself, and something shifted in his chest. Not the magical shift, the clicking into place feeling. Something quieter and more human. "I promise," he said. "Like a person. She nodded. Then she straightened up, ran a hand through her blunt-cut hair, and said, "Right. What's next?" What was next was the technology play, and it was the biggest bet Harry had ever made. He'd been reading about mobile communications for months. The technology was embryonic, massive handsets, terrible coverage, eye-watering costs, but Harry could feel the pull. Not the property-finding pull, but something larger and more diffuse, a sense of trajectory, of where the world's weight was shifting. He'd sit in the library reading technical journals he barely understood and feel the same certainty he felt when he looked at a derelict building and saw what it would become. This technology was going to change everything. The question was how to position himself to benefit. The answer came through the finding. Harry was walking through the city one morning in late July. He liked to walk through the financial district, absorbing its rhythms, reading the human traffic the way he read property listings, when the pull yanked him sideways so hard he almost stumbled. He followed it through 2 side streets and an alley to a small office above a sandwich shop, where a brass plaque read, Meridian Communications Ltd. He stood on the pavement and felt the pull singing. This was it. Whatever it was, this was it. Research took 3 days. Meridian Communications was a small firm, 12 employees, operating out of 2 cramped rooms, that held 3 patents related to cellular signal processing. The patents were potentially valuable. They addressed a bottleneck in signal routing that the industry hadn't solved yet, but the company was burning cash and running out of runway. The founder, a Scottish engineer named Douglas Ray, had been turned down by every venture capital firm in London. He was 3 months from insolvency. Harry did the math. Meridian's patents, if the technology developed as he sensed it would, could be worth hundreds of millions within a decade. The company's current valuation, based on its failing finances, was maybe £50,000. Blackstone Holdings had just over $60,000 in liquid capital. You want to spend almost everything we have on a company that's about to go bankrupt, Thomas said. Not a question. A statement of fact, delivered in the flat tone of a man who'd learned that arguing with Harry was an exercise in futility but felt professionally obligated to register his objections. Not everything. $55,000 for a controlling stake. It leaves us $5,000 in reserve. $5,000. As a buffer against any conceivable disaster. We won't need a buffer. The property income covers our operating costs. The reserve is just comfort. I'm not comfortable. Thomas. Harry looked at him across the desk. The lamp between them cast warm light across spreadsheets and legal pads and Harry's increasingly detailed map of London. I've been right about every property we've bought. Every single one. The Bermondsey Unit, the Tooley Street Warehouse, the Docklands Row, all of them are worth more now than when we bought them, and they'll be worth more again next year. I'm asking you to trust the same instinct on this. Your instinct is terrifying and I don't understand it. You don't need to understand it. You need to act on it. Thomas looked at him for a long time. Then he picked up his pen. I'll draft the acquisition papers tonight. Douglas Ray, when Thomas met him, was a rumpled, exhausted man in his 40s who spoke about signal processing the way poets spoke about sunsets, with passion so genuine it was almost embarrassing. He was also desperate, and when Thomas presented an offer to acquire 51% of Meridian Communications for £55,000, Ray stared at the number with the expression of a drowning man who'd just been thrown a rope. Who are you people? He asked. Blackstone Holdings. We're a property firm with diversification interests. A property firm wants to buy a telecom patent company. We believe in your technology, Mr. Ray. We believe the mobile communications industry is going to grow substantially over the next decade, and we believe your patents position you at the center of that growth. Every VC in London thinks I'm a crank. We're not a venture capital firm. We're investors with a longer time horizon and, frankly, better judgment. Ray signed the papers the next day. Harry, watching from across the street through a cafe window, the unnoticing wrapped around him so thoroughly that even the cafe staff had forgotten he was there, felt the click of rightness that meant he'd made a good bet. He couldn't know yet, that this single investment would eventually be worth more than everything else Blackstone owned combined. But he felt it. The pull was satisfied, the singing in his chest subsiding to a contented hum. Now he had to deal with Victor Hargrove. Hargrove made his first move in August. It was subtle, the kind of move that could have been coincidence if you didn't know to look for patterns. A planning application for a Blackstone renovation in Southwark was delayed. Then a building inspector flagged a Blackstone property in Bermondsey for a surprise review. Then a bank that had been processing Blackstone's accounts requested additional documentation for routine transactions. Individually, nothing. Collectively, a message: someone is paying attention to you. He's testing us, Harry told Thomas. Applying pressure at the edges to see how we respond. How do we respond? We don't. Not yet. We file the appeals, provide the documentation, comply with the inspections. We're clean, everything is legitimate. He can't find anything because there's nothing to find. There's something to find, Harry. There's you. The 9-year-old running the operation from behind a desk. If Hargrove digs deep enough, he won't find me. Nobody sees me unless I want them to. It came out colder than he intended, and Thomas flinched slightly. Harry noticed. He noticed everything, and the fact that his voice had gone cold and flat and adult in a way that bothered the man who was closest to a father he'd ever had, that registered. He filed it away in the same part of his mind where he filed the nightmares and the cupboard and the sound of Vernon's belt. We need intelligence, Harry said, making his voice softer. Not fake soft. Just, trying. We need to know what Hargrove knows and what he's planning. Maggie. Maggie's network had grown. What had started as 20 street kids sharing survival tips had evolved into something more structured, an information web that stretched across central and south London. Maggie's people were invisible in the way that homeless children were always invisible. They existed in the gaps of adult society, seeing everything, noticed by no one. They watched the streets. They listened at doors. They tracked patterns of movement and money with the focused attention of people for whom information was the difference between safety and danger. Harry had never asked Maggie to use her network for corporate intelligence. He'd always treated it as her domain, her people, her rules. But when he explained the Hargrove situation, she didn't hesitate. I've got 2 kids who work near his main office, she said. Sweep the steps, collect the bins. They'll know who comes and goes. And I know a girl who does filing at the Southwark planning office. She's not one of mine, but she owes me. I can ask her to flag anything with Hargrove's name on it. That's exactly what I need. It's spying, Harry. Let's call it what it is. It's information gathering. It's spying. And I'll do it because Hargrove burned my family's restaurant and I want to watch him choke. But don't dress it up in business language. Not with me. She was right, and he knew it, and he nodded. Within 2 weeks, Maggie's network had mapped Hargrove's movements, identified his key associates, and intercepted enough casual conversations to build a picture of his strategy. Hargrove was curious about Blackstone, not threatened, not yet, but intrigued by this small firm that kept appearing in his territory with unerring accuracy. He'd assigned a junior investigator to compile a background report on Thomas Ashworth. The report will come back clean, Thomas said when Harry told him. Disgraced solicitor, drinking problem, lost everything. There's nothing in my history that connects to anything unusual. But it also comes back thin. No capital base, no obvious source of funding, no track record. He'll wonder where the money's coming from. Let him wonder. Wondering keeps him at a distance. And when he stops wondering and starts acting, then we'll be ready. But Harry wasn't entirely sure they would be. Hargrove was a different kind of opponent than anything he'd faced before, not a bully who could be pushed away, not a problem that could be solved with cleverness and magic. Hargrove was a system. A web of money and influence and favors owed and threats implied, extending through the city's institutions like roots through soil. You couldn't fight a system by being smarter. You had to build a better system. Harry was trying. But building took time, and Hargrove had 20 years head start. It was Maggie who suggested the gala. "Hargrove's hosting a charity fundraiser," she said one evening in September. "Some children's hospital thing. Big event, big names. Politicians, business people, media. My girl at the planning office got an invitation list, don't ask how. Thomas could go." Thomas could go, Harry agreed. But Thomas isn't the one who needs to see Hargrove up close. You can't go to a black tie gala, Harry. You're 9. I'm Thomas's nephew. Visiting from the country. He couldn't find a sitter. That's the weakest cover story I've ever heard. It doesn't need to be strong. It needs to be plausible enough for one evening, and people don't question children at social events. They ignore them. Maggie looked at him with an expression he'd learned to read, half exasperation, half reluctant admiration. "You're going to get us all arrested. I'm going to get us information. There's a difference." The gala was held at a hotel in Mayfair, one of the old, intimidating ones where the carpets were thicker than Harry's mattress and the chandeliers cost more than Blackstone's entire first year of revenue. Thomas wore a rented dinner jacket and looked, Harry thought, like the man he'd been before the drinking, distinguished, composed, comfortable in rooms like this. Harry wore a child's suit that Maggie had found God knows where, his hair flattened with water, it sprang back up within minutes, as it always did, and his taped glasses replaced with a new pair Thomas had bought him. The unnoticing was a featherlight veil around him, not full invisibility, just a gentle suggestion that he wasn't interesting enough to look at twice. They arrived at 8. Thomas presented his invitation, obtained through a Blackstone business contact who owed them a favor, and sailed through the entrance with Harry trailing behind him like a quiet, well-behaved shadow. The ballroom was enormous and golden and full of people who smelled like money. Harry had never been in a room like this. The Dursleys' idea of luxury was a new television, this was a different universe. Crystal and candlelight and women in dresses that caught the light like liquid. Men in clusters, laughing, holding glasses of champagne with the easy confidence of people who'd never had to choose between food and shelter. Harry didn't feel intimidated. He felt something sharper and more useful, recognition. These were the people who controlled things. The decision-makers. The ones whose choices rippled outward through the city and shaped the world that people like Maggie and her network lived in. Understanding them, how they thought, what they wanted, what they feared, was as important as understanding property values or patent law. He moved through the room like a ghost, listening. Conversation fragments, a housing minister discussing a transport bill, 2 developers arguing about Dockland's investment, a woman from a bank talking about interest rate projections. Harry absorbed it all, filing each piece of information in the mental architecture he'd built for this purpose. Some of it was useful. Most of it was noise. But the noise had patterns, and patterns were where the value lived. He found Hargrove at the center of the room, naturally, surrounded by a small orbit of people who were clearly trying to impress him. Victor Hargrove was tall, well over 6 feet, with silver hair swept back from a face that was handsome in the way expensive things were handsome, well-maintained, symmetrical, designed to project quality. His suit was immaculate. His smile was wide and warm and reached approximately as far as his cheekbones before stopping dead, leaving his eyes untouched. Harry watched him from across the room and felt nothing from the finding. No pull, no singing, no sense of hidden things. Hargrove wasn't a lost object or a hidden opportunity. He was a visible obstacle, fully present, fully dangerous. Thomas approached Hargrove during a lull, introducing himself as the director of Blackstone Holdings. Harry drifted closer, staying in Thomas's shadow, unremarkable. Blackstone, Hargrove said, and the name sat in his mouth like he was tasting it. I've heard the name. Property firm, yes. You've been active in Southwark. We have. It's an exciting area. It is. I've held positions there for some time. The development potential is significant. Hargrove's eyes were steady on Thomas's face, assessing, measuring, filing. You've done well for a young firm. Rapid growth. I always wonder, with rapid growth, what's the engine? What's driving it? Good analysis and patient capital, Thomas said. And a little luck, perhaps. Perhaps. Luck is interesting. Hargrove sipped his champagne. It tends to run out. The threat was so smooth it barely registered as a threat at all. Just a casual observation. A remark about the weather of business. Thomas smiled and deflected, and they moved on to pleasantries about the charity and the hospital, and Harry watched it all from 3 feet away, invisible, cataloging every micro-expression on Hargrove's face. Then Hargrove looked down and saw him. The unnoticing should have held. It had held all evening. Waiters had walked around Harry without registering his presence, other guests had looked through him as if he were made of air. But Hargrove's gaze landed on him and stayed, and Harry felt the unnoticing bend like a branch under too much weight. "And who's this?" Hargrove said. "My nephew," Thomas said without missing a beat. "Harry. He's staying with me for the weekend." "Harry." Hargrove crouched slightly, not all the way down, not to Harry's level, just enough to acknowledge him without diminishing himself. "Enjoying the party?" "The canapés are good," Harry said. "The conversations are better." A flicker in Hargrove's eyes. Surprise. Reassessment. "You've been listening to the conversations?" "It's hard not to. People talk very loudly when they think no one important is listening." Hargrove stared at him. Harry stared back. He kept his face neutral, his voice light, his body language that of a precocious child making a funny observation. But he didn't drop his eyes. He'd spent years dropping his eyes around Vernon Dursley, making himself small and harmless and invisible. He would never do that again. "Interesting boy," Hargrove said to Thomas. He straightened up. "You should bring him around more often. He's got good eyes." A pause. Dangerous eyes, for a child. He moved on. Thomas exhaled slowly. Harry watched Hargrove cross the room and greet a member of Parliament with the same warm, dead-eyed smile. "We need to leave," Thomas murmured. "He saw you, Harry. Really saw you." "I know. That wasn't supposed to happen." "I know. Are you concerned?" Harry thought about it. The honest answer was yes. Hargrove's attention was a searchlight, and standing in it felt like being peeled open layer by layer. But the dishonest answer was more useful right now. "He saw a child," Harry said. "A clever child, but a child. He won't connect me to Blackstone. Not from this." Thomas didn't look convinced. Harry wasn't entirely convinced himself. But they left the gala with what they'd come for, a direct read on Victor Hargrove, his manner, his methods, the texture of his threat. And one other thing, a piece of information Harry had picked up from a conversation between 2 council members near the bar, about a planned infrastructure project in East London that hadn't been announced yet. Harry filed it. It would be useful later. Everything was useful later. It was 2 days after the gala, a Tuesday, the kind of grey London afternoon where the sky looked like the underside of an old mattress, when Harry walked into a bookshop on Charing Cross Road. He hadn't planned to. The finding had been quiet all day, no pulls, no singing, just the background hum he'd learned to live with, and he'd been walking without destination, thinking about Hargrove and Meridian and the way the city's patterns shifted and flowed. Walking helped him think. London was a good city for walking and thinking, it rewarded both. The bookshop was narrow and deep, wedged between a tourist tat shop and a café. The sign above the door read tomes and scrolls in faded gold lettering, and the window display was a jumble of old books, some of them genuinely ancient, cracked leather bindings, pages edged with gold that had gone brown with age. Harry glanced at it and felt nothing from the finding. But something else stirred, not the pull, but a prickling at the base of his skull. Like the static you felt before a thunderstorm. He went in anyway. Curiosity had always been stronger than caution with him. The Dursleys had tried to crush it out of him, it was perhaps the one thing they'd failed to touch. The shop was dim and smelled of old paper and something else, something sharp and green, like crushed leaves. Shelves lined every wall, floor to ceiling, packed with books that ranged from mundane paperbacks to things that looked like they belonged in a museum. The shop appeared empty, but Harry could feel a presence, not threatening, just there, somewhere in the back. He browsed. His fingers trailed along spines. Most of the books were ordinary, histories, novels, atlases. But at the back of the shop, past a curtain of dusty velvet, the stock changed. The titles were different here, Ley Lines of the British Isles. A compendium of Celtic sacred sites. The Hidden Architecture of London, Magic and Geometry in Urban Planning. Harry pulled this last one from the shelf and opened it. Diagrams of buildings overlaid with geometric patterns. Maps of London marked with symbols he didn't recognize. A chapter titled, The Undertow, Myth or Memory. His heart beat faster. That's not for sale. Harry turned. A young woman stood at the end of the aisle, mid-twenties, dark hair pulled back, sharp features, wearing a cardigan over a shop apron. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't read. Not the glazed disinterest of the unnoticed, she saw him clearly, which meant the unnoticing wasn't working, which meant, "You're one of us," she said. Her voice was carefully neutral, but her eyes were wide. "You're a wizard." Harry's hand tightened on the book. The prickling at his skull intensified. He could feel her now, a resonance, like two tuning forks vibrating at the same frequency. She had the same energy he did. The same thing in her chest. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "Yes, you do. I can feel your magic from here and Christ, it's like standing next to a bonfire." She took a step closer, then stopped herself. Her hand went to her pocket and stayed there, gripping something. "Who are you? Where did you come from? You're too young to be, you haven't been to Hogwarts, have you?" "I don't know what Hogwarts is." "A school. A school for people like us. For wizards and witches." She stared at him. "How old are you?" 9. 9. "And you're already this powerful?" That shouldn't be possible. Not without training." She seemed to collect herself, pulling her composure back like a coat she'd shrugged off. "I'm sorry. I'm being rude. My name is Elara Voss. This is my shop. Well, I manage it. And you are?" Harry hesitated. Every instinct honed by the streets and the Dursleys told him to lie. Give a false name, walk out, disappear. But the resonance between them was real, and the book in his hands promised answers to questions that had been eating at him for months. "Harry," he said. "Just Harry." Elara Voss took him into the back room of the shop, a small space cluttered with books and packing materials and a kettle that she set boiling with a wave of her hand. Harry watched the kettle click on without being touched and felt a jolt of recognition so strong it was almost painful. He could do that. He'd been doing that, for years, without knowing what it was. "Tea?" she said. "Please." She made 2 cups. They sat across from each other at a small table and she told him about magic. Not all of it. Not even a fraction. But enough. She told him about the wizarding world, a hidden society that existed alongside the mundane, she called it Muggle world, concealed by something called the Statute of Secrecy. She told him about Hogwarts, a school in Scotland where witches and wizards learned to control their abilities. She told him about the Ministry of Magic, the governing body that enforced the statute and regulated magical society. She told him about wands and spells and potions and creatures. About a war that had ended 7 years ago, fought against a dark wizard so feared that most people still wouldn't say his name. About the boy who had survived that wizard's attack as an infant, the only person ever known to have done so, and who was famous throughout the wizarding world. His name, Elara said, and then stopped. She was looking at Harry's forehead. At the scar, the lightning bolt scar, usually hidden beneath his fringe. She'd been looking at it intermittently throughout the conversation, and now her face had gone very pale. "That scar," she said. Harry touched it. "I've always had it." "Harry. What's your surname?" The silence between them was heavy with something Harry could feel but couldn't name. He weighed his options. Lie. Deflect. Leave. But Elara's face was open and frightened and honest in a way that made lying feel wrong. "Potter," he said. Elara set her teacup down very carefully, as if she was afraid sudden movements might shatter something. "Harry Potter," she said. "You're Harry Potter. Apparently. The entire wizarding world thinks you're living with your muggle relatives. Albus Dumbledore himself placed you there. There are protections, they say there are blood wards." "I left," Harry said. "Over a year ago. The protections, whatever they were, didn't protect me from the people inside the house." He said it flat and simple and didn't elaborate, and something in his tone made Elara close her mouth on whatever question she'd been about to ask. "Does anyone know?" she said. "In the wizarding world? Does Dumbledore know you're gone?" "I don't know who Dumbledore is and I don't care. What I care about is understanding what I can do. I can find things, lost things, hidden things. I can make people not notice me. I can fix broken objects by concentrating. I can push things without touching them. I can warm rooms and seal cracks and make locks open. Is that normal? For a wizard?" Elara's pale face had acquired a faintly dazed quality. "Some of it is. Accidental magic in children is common, locks opening, things breaking, uncontrolled bursts. But what you're describing isn't accidental. It's controlled. It's refined. You're doing wandless, wordless magic at 9 years old with no training, and doing it consistently and precisely. That's not normal. That's..." She searched for the word. "Unprecedented. Can you teach me more?" I'm not a professor, Harry. I left the wizarding world 2 years ago. I had my reasons and they're my own. I know basic magic, defensive spells, some theory. But what you need is proper training. Hogwarts, will they try to control me? The question hung in the air. Elara looked at him, really looked, past the small frame and the taped glasses and the old clothes, and saw what Thomas and Maggie had seen. A will that was not going to be bent. Not by anyone. Not ever again. "Probably," she said honestly. "You're Harry Potter. You're the boy who lived. The most famous child in magical Britain. There are people who have plans for you. Dumbledore among them. Then I'm not going. Not yet. Not on anyone's terms but mine." He leaned forward. "Teach me what you can. The basics. The theory. Enough that I can make informed decisions about my own abilities. And in exchange..." Harry smiled. It was the smile that Maggie called his businessman smile, not cold, exactly, but calibrated. The smile of someone who knew the value of what he was offering. "In exchange, I'll tell you something you want to know. I can see it, you left the wizarding world but you didn't leave magic behind. You're working in a bookshop full of magical texts. You're still connected. You still care. You want to understand the old magic, the ley lines, the deep patterns, the things underneath London. I've felt them. I can show you what I've found." Elara stared at him. "You felt the ley lines?" "I've seen them. In a kind of vision. Rivers of light under the city. Channels and nodes. Something vast and old and aware. That's the theoretical literature suggests, she caught herself. Took a breath. You're 9 years old and you're negotiating with me. I'm 9 years old and I'm offering a fair exchange. Is it a deal? She looked at him for a long moment. Then she extended her hand. Deal, she said. They shook on it, and Harry felt the resonance between them hum like a plucked string. She was the first person he'd met who was like him, who had the same energy, the same potential, the same weird impossible reality thrumming beneath their skin. It was like discovering that the language you thought you'd invented, the private language of the cupboard and the dark, was actually spoken by other people. That you weren't alone. That you'd never been alone, and the solitude had been constructed, deliberately, by people who decided what was best for you without asking. That thought made him angry in a way he couldn't afford to be angry right now. He filed it next to the nightmares and the cupboard and Hargrove's dead-eyed smile and moved on. Elara began teaching him the following week. 2 hours, twice a week, in the back room of the bookshop. She taught him theory first, the principles of magical energy, the taxonomy of spells, the relationship between intent and effect. Harry absorbed it with the same voracity he'd brought to the Financial Times, making connections and asking questions that made Elara alternately impressed and unsettled. You're treating magic like a system, she said after their third session. Like an engineering problem. Isn't it? Most wizards don't think of it that way. It's taught as art, not science. Wand movements and incantations and feeling the magic. That's because most wizards grew up with magic and learned it by imitation. I grew up with nothing and had to figure it out from raw principles. Of course I think of it as a system. It is a system. Energy, intent, effect. Input, process, output. The wand is a focusing tool. The incantation is a psychological anchor. The underlying mechanism is will. Elara was quiet for a moment. You know, you sound like someone I read about once. A theorist from the 1700s. Archimedes Blackwood. He tried to systematize magic the way Newton systematized physics. The establishment laughed at him. Was he right? Probably. Nobody listened long enough to find out. Harry filed that name too. Everything was useful later. The lessons had an unexpected side effect, they sharpened his existing abilities dramatically. Understanding the theory of what he was doing, the principles of magical energy, the mechanics of intent, allowed him to refine his instinctive techniques. The finding became more precise, extending further, distinguishing between types of lost things with greater clarity. The unnoticing evolved from a blunt cloak into a sophisticated tool that he could modulate, making himself completely invisible to one person while remaining fully visible to another. The push became a scalpel instead of a hammer. And new abilities emerged. He learned to feel the emotional states of people nearby, not read minds, nothing so precise, but sense the broad strokes of what someone was feeling. Fear. Anger. Greed. Deception. It was like the finding, but for feelings instead of objects. It was incredibly useful in business negotiations, and Harry used it without hesitation. Until the day Maggie saw him do it. They were in the office. Thomas was negotiating with a property seller who was being difficult, an old woman who owned a row of shops in Deptford and didn't want to sell. Harry was sitting in the corner, invisible, extending his emotional sense toward the woman. She was afraid. Not of them, of something else, something personal. Harry found the thread of that fear and pulled, gently, nudging it toward the surface. The woman's resistance crumbled. She agreed to sell at below market value. Thomas shook her hand and she left looking dazed and slightly confused, as if she'd just woken from a nap and couldn't remember falling asleep. Maggie was waiting outside. She'd been watching through the window. You did something to her, she said. Not a question. Harry didn't insult her intelligence by denying it. I helped the negotiation along. You pushed her. I saw it. I saw her face change. She went all blank. Like those blokes at the planning office last month. You made her feel something she didn't want to feel and she folded because of it. She was going to sell eventually. The price was fair, the price isn't the point, Harry. Maggie's voice was tight. You made her do something she didn't want to do. You got inside her head and you pushed. That's not business. That's, I don't even know what to call it. Effective. Wrong. The word you're looking for is wrong. They stood in the street, Harry looking up at Maggie. She was taller, she was always going to be taller, and the silence between them was thick with something that hadn't been there before. Something that tasted like the distance between what Harry could do and what Harry should do. My parents' restaurant was burned by men who decided they knew better, Maggie said quietly. Men who thought the ends justified the means. Men who looked at ordinary people and saw obstacles. She held his gaze. Don't become that, Harry. You're better than that. Don't make me wrong about you. She walked away. Harry stood on the pavement and felt something he hadn't felt since the cupboard, small. He thought about it for 3 days. The magic hummed in his chest, offering itself, ready to be used however he chose. He could push and find and influence. He could shape the world around him like clay. Nobody could stop him. Nobody even knew to try. That was the problem, wasn't it? Nobody could stop him. And if nobody could stop you, the only check on your behavior was yourself. Your own sense of right and wrong. Your own decision about what kind of person you wanted to be. Harry sat in the office after midnight, the city quiet around him, and made a decision. He wrote it down in his notebook, in the same precise handwriting he used for accounts and property listings. No compulsion. No emotional manipulation. No making anyone do anything against their will. Find opportunities, don't create them. Win on merit or don't win at all. It was, he realized, the hardest thing he'd ever done. Harder than leaving Privet Drive. Harder than sleeping rough. Harder than any of it. He showed the notebook to Maggie the next day. She read it. Looked at him. Nodded once. Good, she said. And that was all she said, and it was enough. August ended and the city shimmered in the late summer heat. Blackstone Holdings now owned 17 properties across South and East London, with a total portfolio value that Thomas estimated at just over £2 million. The Meridian investment was appreciating quietly in the background, the patents attracting interest from larger telecom firms. Harry had a network, a mentor, an educator, and more money than the Dursleys would see in a lifetime. And something was going wrong at the edges. It started with a property in Rotherhithe. A recently renovated building, one of Harry's best, a former tannery converted into studio spaces, began to have problems. Not structural problems. The structure was flawless, Harry had reinforced it himself. But the tenants complained of cold spots that moved through rooms like drafts from nowhere. Lights flickered. Electronics malfunctioned. One tenant, a photographer, reported that her prints were developing wrong, shadows in the images that hadn't been there when the photos were taken. Shadows shaped like faces. Harry investigated. Stood in the empty studio at night and felt something. Not the finding. Not the ley line pulse. Something different, something that skittered at the edge of his perception like a rat in a wall. Present but hidden. Watching. He told Alara. She went pale. That building, she said. Is it near a ley line junction? Harry checked his map. It was. One of the secondary nodes he'd identified, not a major convergence, but a point where two lines crossed beneath the street. The old magic is responding to something, Alara said. You, probably. Your use of magic in the mundane world is, it's not supposed to happen like this, Harry. Wizards use wands, in controlled environments, with decades of institutional practice behind them. You're using raw, unfocused power in places that haven't seen magic in centuries. The ley lines are reacting. Reacting how? I don't know. The theory is sketchy at best. There are old stories, very old, pre-Hogwarts, about what happens when the deep magic is disturbed. They call it the undertow. A kind of immune response. The accumulated magical energy of the land protecting itself. Protecting itself from what? From disruption. From change. From anything that threatens the balance. She paused. From us. Harry thought about the station that didn't exist, glimpsed from a passing train. The frost patterns in the tunnels. The feeling of being watched by something vast and patient. It's getting stronger, he said. Then you need to be more careful. Less visible magic. Less disruption. I can't do that. The magic is how I fix the buildings. It's how I find the opportunities. It's the foundation of everything. Then you need to find a balance. Or the balance is going to find you, and you won't like how it does it. He didn't have time to worry about it. Not then. Because something else was wrong. Something more immediate and more human. A deal fell through. The property in Deptford, the one with the old woman, the one Maggie had confronted him about, was supposed to close in mid-August. But the seller had gone back on the agreement, claiming she couldn't remember agreeing to the terms. Thomas had the signed contracts, but the woman was adamant, she'd never seen them before, didn't recognize her own signature, couldn't recall the meeting. It's like she's been. Thomas trailed off, looking at Harry. I didn't do this, Harry said flatly. I made a commitment. No compulsion. I haven't touched her mind. Then someone else did. A week later, a newly renovated building in Bermondsey developed an infestation. Not rats. Not mice. Something that skittered in the walls at night and left marks on the inside of doors, marks that looked like scratches, but were too regular, too patterned, to be animal. The exterminator Thomas called took one look and refused to go inside. Then a batch of financial records at the Blackstone office was corrupted. Not digitally, they were paper records, and the ink had simply changed. Numbers were different. Dates had shifted. Entries that Thomas knew he'd written showed different figures in his own handwriting. Someone is doing this, Harry said. Someone with magic. You're the only wizard in London, Thomas said. No. I'm not. He could feel it now, when he concentrated. A second presence, a magical signature, different from his own, different from Alara's. Colder. More disciplined. Older. It was operating at the edges of his territory, touching his operations with precise, targeted interference. Not random vandalism but strategic disruption. Someone who understood business and understood magic and was using both with the coordination of a professional. Harry reached out with the finding, searching for the source. He found traces, magical residue clinging to the corrupted documents, to the walls of the infested building, to the old woman's confused memories. The residue had a signature, a texture, like a fingerprint left in magic. Cold and sharp and faintly metallic. It tasted of old blood and ambition. He couldn't trace it to a source. Whoever was behind this knew how to cover their tracks. But the message was clear, you're not alone. And you're not welcome. Harry sat in his office and stared at the map of London. 17 properties. A technology investment. A growing empire. And somewhere in the city, someone with powers like his own had declared war. He thought about Hargrove, who was a known threat with known methods. He thought about the undertow, which was a vast and inhuman threat that might or might not be directed at him specifically. And now this, a third threat, a magical one, operating in the shadows. 3 fronts. He was 9 years old and fighting on 3 fronts. He picked up his pen and started planning. The planning led him to Alara, who led him to a name. There are rumors, she said carefully, about a wizard operating in Muggle London. Off the grid. Outside the ministry's jurisdiction, or at least, outside their attention. He's supposed to be a former. Former what? Death Eater. A follower of the Dark Wizard. The one who killed your parents. The silence in the bookshop was absolute. Tell me everything, Harry said. I don't know everything. Nobody does. He's a ghost. But the name I've heard is not. Cyrus Knott. He was never convicted. He claimed he'd been under the Imperious curse, forced to serve against his will. Half the Death Eaters used that defense and most of them were lying. He disappeared after the war. No one knows where he went. London, Harry said. He went to London. And he's been building something here. Something in the cracks between your world and mine. If that's true, Harry, if there's a Death Eater operating in Muggle London, that's not something you can handle alone. The ministry doesn't know I exist. And I'd like to keep it that way. You can't fight a Death Eater. They're trained. They're dangerous. They use curses that, I'm not going to fight him. Not yet. I'm going to find out what he's doing, how big his operation is, and what he wants. Then I'm going to decide how to deal with him. Elara looked at him with an expression that had become familiar, the look of someone watching a child do something so far beyond his years that it was almost frightening. You're going to get yourself killed, she said. People keep telling me that. I'm still here. He left the bookshop and walked into the evening, and the city spread before him, vast and complicated and full of hidden things, and he thought about the word Elara had used. Death Eater. Someone who had followed the wizard who killed his parents. Someone who had chosen darkness and cruelty and power over others as a way of life. Someone who was now, apparently, running an operation in Harry's city. Harry Potter was 9 years old. He had a property empire, a technology investment, a network of street kids, a recovering solicitor, a witch tutor, and more raw magical power than any of them knew what to do with. He had enemies on 3 fronts and allies who loved him and a city that was starting to wake up under his feet. He should have been terrified. Part of him was. But mostly, standing on Charing Cross Road in the fading September light, he felt something else. Something that had been growing in him since the night he walked out of the cupboard. Not confidence. Not arrogance. Something quieter than both. Certainty. He knew who he was. He knew what he could do. He knew what he was willing to sacrifice and what he would never compromise. And he knew, with the same bone-deep sureness that guided the finding, that whatever came next, he would face it on his own terms. He turned toward the tube station. He had a meeting with Thomas about the quarterly accounts. He had a lesson with Elara tomorrow. He had a war to prepare for. But first, he stopped at the newsstand on the corner. The Evening Standard's headline caught his eye, mystery firm Blackstone Holdings valued at £200 million. He bought a copy. Read the article standing on the pavement, the crowd flowing around him, the unnoticing making him a gap in the human current. The article was speculative, based on portfolio analysis and industry estimates, but the number was in the right ballpark. Thomas had been conservative at $2 million. The truth was that the Meridian patents alone were now worth an estimated $150 million, based on licensing interest from 3 major telecom firms, and the property portfolio was growing at a rate that defied conventional analysis. $200 million. From £2,000 and a stolen strongbox, in just over a year. Harry folded the newspaper under his arm and walked down the stairs into the underground. The platform was crowded with commuters, tired faces, slumped shoulders, the end-of-day shuffle of people going home to lives they didn't think about too hard. Harry stood among them and felt invisible, and for once it wasn't magic. It was just being small and young and unremarkable. The train came. He got on. Found a seat between a woman reading a romance novel and a man asleep against the window. As the train pulled away, Harry glanced at the tunnel wall sliding past the window and saw, just for a moment, something that shouldn't have been there. A face, formed in the frost that shouldn't exist on a warm September evening, pressed against the tile as if looking through it from the other side. It was vast and featureless and impossibly old, and it was looking at him. Then the train moved on and the face was gone and Harry was just a boy on a train, going home, carrying a newspaper that said he was worth £200 million. He opened his notebook and started writing. Back at the office, Thomas was waiting. The newspaper was on his desk, open to the article. "Have you seen this?" he said. "Bought a copy on the way here. 200 million, Harry. Even if it's an overestimate, even if the real number is half that," Thomas shook his head slowly. "When you found me under that bridge, I thought you were a mad child with a bag of coins. I want you to know that. I know. And I want you to know something else." Thomas stood. He was steady. His eyes were clear. 11 months sober, and every day of it showed, not in ease, but in effort. The deliberate, visible effort of a man choosing, moment by moment, to be someone worth being. "Whatever happens next, Hargrove, this magical business, whatever's coming, I'm with you. Not because you're paying me. Because you gave me something I didn't earn and couldn't have asked for." "What's that?" "A reason to get up in the morning." He paused. "And for what it's worth, I'm proud of you. In case no one said that before." Harry looked at him. The words landed in a place he didn't know he had, somewhere beneath the planning and the finding and the Empire building, in the small, dark space that still smelled like dust and shoe polish. The cupboard inside him that he carried everywhere. "No one has," he said. "Said that before." Thomas nodded. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Harry sat down at his desk and opened the notebook and the newspaper and the map of London with its colored pins and glowing ley lines drawn in ink that Alara had enchanted to pulse faintly in the dark. 3 fronts. 3 enemies. A city full of hidden things and a boy who could find them. He picked up a red pin and placed it on the map. Somewhere beneath the city, the undertow pulsed. Somewhere in a Mayfair office, Victor Hargrove stared at a photograph, a grainy image of a dark-haired boy entering a Blackstone property, and felt the first cold stirrings of genuine alarm. And somewhere in the shadows between worlds, Cyrus Knott sat in a room lit by no natural light and smiled a thin, cold smile and planned his next move. The game was getting bigger. The stakes were getting higher. And Harry Potter, 9 years old, was right in the middle of all of it. He wouldn't have had it any other way. Chapter 3, The Weight of Two Worlds. The first time Harry felt something break that he hadn't meant to break, he was standing in the basement office at 3 in the morning, reading a letter from a Southwark council member who'd just blocked a Blackstone planning application for the 3rd time. The letter was polite. Bureaucratically polite, which was the worst kind, all passive constructions and regretful language wrapping a simple message: no. Because I said so. Because someone more powerful than you asked me to. Hargrove's fingerprints were all over it, invisible but unmistakable, and Harry stood in the lamplight reading it and felt the anger come up through him like groundwater rising through a crack in a basement floor. The lamp exploded. Not flickered. Not dimmed. Exploded, the glass bulb shattering outward in a spray of fragments that peppered the far wall like shrapnel. The filing cabinet next to Harry's desk buckled inward, its metal sides crumpling as if squeezed by an enormous hand. Every piece of paper on every surface in the room lifted simultaneously and hung in the air for 3 heartbeats before drifting down like oversized confetti. Harry stood in the dark, breathing hard, glass crunching under his shoes. His hands were shaking. The anger was gone, drained out of him as fast as it had come, leaving behind a cold, sick emptiness and the sound of his own pulse in his ears. He cleaned up the glass by hand. Not with magic. With his hands, picking up each shard carefully, methodically, placing them in a bin bag. It took 40 minutes. He cut himself twice. He didn't heal the cuts. He needed to feel them. Thomas found the buckled filing cabinet the next morning and said nothing. He looked at it, looked at Harry, and went to make tea. But Harry saw the way his hands tightened around the kettle, and he knew that Thomas was afraid. Not of the filing cabinet. Of him. That was September. By October, the cracks were everywhere. Blackstone Holdings was growing at a pace that would have been remarkable for a firm run by a team of experienced professionals. For a firm secretly run by a 9-year-old wizard, it was something closer to miraculous, and miracles, Harry was learning, had costs that didn't show up on balance sheets. Thomas was drowning in paperwork. The legal complexity of maintaining Harry's anonymity while running an increasingly visible company required a web of shell entities, nominee directors, and creative accounting that grew more intricate by the week. Thomas handled it with the meticulous precision of the solicitor he'd been, but the volume was crushing. He was working 16-hour days, sleeping in the office, skipping meals, and developing a tremor in his right hand that he tried to hide by keeping it in his pocket. Harry noticed. Harry noticed everything. But noticing and doing something about it were different skills, and the second one required a kind of emotional bandwidth that Harry was running out of. Because the magical attacks hadn't stopped. Since August, Cyrus Knott, the invisible enemy, the former Death Eater operating somewhere in the shadows of London, had been conducting a systematic campaign of interference against Blackstone's operations. It was precise, patient, and deeply unnerving. Properties developed problems that no contractor could explain, pipes that froze in warm weather, doors that wouldn't stay locked, electrical systems that worked perfectly until the moment a tenant tried to use them. Records were altered, not destroyed, which would have been obvious, but subtly changed, numbers shifted by small amounts that might not be caught for weeks. And the people around Harry were being affected. Thomas forgot meetings he'd confirmed hours earlier. Maggie's network reported gaps, kids who'd been reliable suddenly couldn't remember what they'd been asked to watch. A building manager Harry trusted walked into traffic on a Tuesday afternoon, narrowly missed by a bus, and told the paramedics he'd heard someone calling his name from the other side of the street. There was no one there. Harry could feel Knott's magic like weather, a cold front pressing against his awareness, testing his defenses, probing for weaknesses. The magical signature he'd identified was becoming familiar, sharp, disciplined, faintly metallic. The work of someone trained in magical combat, someone who understood magic as a weapon rather than a tool. Harry's defenses were crude by comparison. He'd spent weeks with Alara learning basic warding theory, the principles of magical barriers, protections, countermeasures, but translating theory into practice was like learning to swim from a book and then being thrown into the ocean. His wards were blunt instruments, walls of raw power that he wrapped around his properties and his people, burning through magical energy at a rate that left him exhausted and sick. "You're overextending," Alara told him during a lesson in late October. She'd been watching him ward a model of one of his buildings, a small wooden box she'd enchanted to simulate a real structure, and his face was gray with effort, sweat standing on his forehead despite the cold. "You're trying to protect everything at once. No one can do that. Not even Dumbledore. Dumbledore isn't being attacked by a Death Eater while running a property empire. No. Dumbledore is sitting in a castle in Scotland wondering where you are. Which brings me to something I need to tell you." Harry lowered his hands. The ward around the model box flickered and died. "What?" "There have been inquiries. At the ministry. Someone, I don't know who, has been asking questions about underage magic usage in the London area. Unusual patterns. The Trace, the what?" "The Trace. It's a monitoring spell placed on all underage wizards in Britain. It detects magic performed by anyone under 17. When you use magic, the ministry knows, or should know. But your magic is different. Wandless, wordless, powered by raw intent rather than structured spells. The Trace doesn't seem to pick it up clearly. It registers as background noise, not specific acts. But it registers. And someone has noticed the noise. The ministry. Possibly. Or someone watching the ministry's instruments. Either way, you're not as invisible as you think you are." Harry filed this. Another threat. Another variable. The walls of his strategic landscape were getting crowded. Who would be watching the Ministry's instruments, he asked. Dumbledore has his own monitoring devices. He's the chief warlock of the Wisengamot and the headmaster of Hogwarts. He has access to resources most wizards can't imagine. And he has a particular interest in one specific underage wizard. Me. You. Harry stood. The weariness from the warding exercise was bone-deep, a fatigue that went past physical exhaustion into something that felt like his magic itself was tired. He was 9 years old and he was tired in ways that 9-year-olds shouldn't be. I can't fight everyone at once, he said. It was the first time he'd admitted it out loud. The words felt like stones being set down, heavy, necessary, a relief. Elara looked at him with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite compassion. Something more complicated. Then stop trying to prioritize. What's the biggest threat right now? Not. He's the only one actively attacking me. Hargrove is a long-term problem. The Ministry, Dumbledore, they're watching but not acting. Not is acting. Then deal with not. I don't know where he is. I can feel his magic but I can't trace it. He's too good at covering his tracks. Then make him come to you. Harry looked at her. Elara looked back, steady and serious, and he saw in her eyes the thing she rarely showed, the sharp, strategic intelligence that had made her, he suspected, far more than a simple bookshop manager in her previous life. You left the wizarding world for a reason, Harry said slowly. You've never told me what it was. No. I haven't. Was it not? The silence lasted 3 seconds too long. Not directly, Elara said. But not unrelatedly. People like Not, people who treat the statute of secrecy as an obstacle rather than a protection, they create pressure. On the system. On the people within the system who see what's happening and can't get anyone to listen. I reported concerns to the Ministry. About dark magic artifacts appearing in Muggle markets. About potions being diluted and sold to Muggles. I was told to mind my own business. When I pushed, I was told more firmly. She paused. I left before they could make me leave. Set up the bookshop. Kept my eyes open. Kept waiting for someone to do something. And no one did. Not until you walked through my door. Harry nodded. The pieces were clicking into place, Elara's knowledge of the underbelly, her willingness to help a rogue child wizard, her careful, fearful attention to the dark magic at the edges of London. She wasn't just a shopkeeper. She was a sentinel. A watcher who'd been standing guard so long she'd forgotten she was waiting for reinforcements. I'll deal with Not, Harry said. But I need to know what I'm walking into. Everything you know about his operation. Everything you've seen, heard, suspected. No more parceling it out. All of it. Elara took a breath. Then she told him. The picture she painted was worse than Harry had imagined. Not wasn't just a rogue wizard hiding from the Ministry. He was an architect, someone who'd spent years building a criminal network that straddled the line between the wizarding and Muggle worlds. He operated out of multiple locations across London, none of them fixed, all of them warded against detection. His income streams were diverse, smuggled magical artifacts sold to wealthy Muggle collectors who thought they were buying antiques, potions diluted and repackaged as health supplements, beauty treatments, mood enhancers, enchanted gambling operations where wizards wagered with magical objects and Muggles lost money they couldn't remember betting. He's smart, Elara said. The Muggle side of his operation looks legitimate on paper. The magical side is invisible to the Ministry because it's happening in Muggle territory, and the Ministry doesn't monitor Muggle territory. He's found the gap between the two worlds and built an empire in it. Like me, Harry said. The words sat in the air between them like something fragile and sharp. Not like you, Elara said firmly. You build things. He exploits them. There's a difference. Harry wanted to believe her. But the parallel was uncomfortable, two wizards operating in the space between worlds, building power outside the established structures, invisible to the authorities. The methods were different. The motives were different. But the shape was the same, and that bothered him more than he could say. November came in cold and wet and not made his move. Harry was walking home from the library, home being the office, which had become home the way a foxhole becomes home during a war, not by choice but by necessity, when he felt the air change. Not temperature. Texture. The magic around him thickened like honey, slowing his steps, pressing against his skin, and a voice spoke from the alley to his left. Harry Potter. The boy who builds. Harry stopped. He didn't run. Running was what prey did, and he'd stopped being prey the night he walked out of the cupboard. He turned toward the voice and pushed the unnoticing away. If this was happening, he wanted to face it clearly. The man who stepped from the alley was not what Harry had expected. He'd imagined someone sinister, dark robes, menacing posture, the aesthetic of a villain from a storybook. Cyrus Knott was nothing like that. He was lean, middle-aged, with silver-streaked dark hair and a face that belonged at a university or a private club, sharp features, amused eyes, the easy bearing of someone who'd never had to justify his own existence. He wore a well-cut coat over what might have been a muggle suit or might have been something else. The lines were too precise, the fabric too fluid. He carried no visible wand. His hands were in his pockets and his posture was relaxed and his magic radiated from him like heat from a furnace, controlled, immense, and very, very dangerous. "You're a difficult boy to meet," Knott said. "Your words are rather impressive for someone self-taught. Crude, but enthusiastic. What do you want?" Knott smiled. It was a warm smile, genuine, reaching his eyes. It was the most frightening thing about him. To talk. Only to talk. "I've been watching you for some time, Harry, may I call you Harry? And I must confess, I'm fascinated. A child wizard operating freely in the Muggle world, building a financial empire from nothing, with no training, no support, no wand. It's extraordinary. You're extraordinary. You've been attacking my properties. Altering my records. Interfering with my people's minds. Testing, not corrected gently. Not attacking. I wanted to understand what you were. How powerful, how clever, how resilient. You've exceeded every expectation. The warding alone, untrained, wandless, and you held me off for weeks. Do you know how remarkable that is? I know you hurt people. A man walked into traffic because of your magic. An unfortunate side effect. I apologize. Mind magic at a distance is imprecise, even for me. I assure you, no permanent harm was intended. He sounded sincere. That was the terrifying part, he sounded sincere, and Harry's emotional sense, the ability he'd been developing under Alara's tutelage, was reading nothing but genuine interest in something that felt disturbingly like admiration. No malice. No deception. Either Knott was so skilled at masking his emotions that Harry's sense couldn't penetrate the disguise, or he genuinely meant what he was saying. Harry suspected the former but couldn't prove it. "Come," Knott said. "Let me show you something. I think you'll find it educational." Every survival instinct Harry possessed screamed no. Walking into a dark wizard's territory, alone, without backup, without even a proper understanding of defensive magic, it was suicide. It was the stupidest possible decision. But Harry had built his empire on walking into situations where the odds were against him and the smart money said run. And the truth, the uncomfortable, inconvenient truth, was that he needed to understand Knott. Needed to see his operation, assess his strength, find his weaknesses. He couldn't fight what he couldn't see. "If you try to hurt me," Harry said, "I'll bring every ward I've built down on top of both of us. You felt my power. You know I can do it." Knott's smile widened. "I wouldn't dream of it. After you." They walked. Not led him through backstreets and alleys, moving through London's hidden geography with the ease of someone who'd spent years mapping its secret passages. They entered a building in Mayfair through a door that Harry could have sworn wasn't there a moment ago, and inside, the space was larger than the outside should have allowed, stretching into a grand, candlelit room that blended Muggle luxury with something older and stranger. It was a club. That was the best word for it, a private club, with leather armchairs and dark wood and the smell of expensive cigars, but the candles floated without holders, the drinks poured themselves, and the patrons were a mix of people who looked Muggle and people who very clearly weren't. A woman in the corner had hair that moved independent of any breeze, shifting color as Harry watched. A man at the bar was playing cards with a deck that shuffled itself. In a back room, visible through a half-open door, a roulette wheel spun silently, its ball leaving trails of gold light in the air. The Meridian Club, Not said. My modest establishment. A place where the two worlds meet in comfort and mutual benefit. Wizard and Muggle, side by side, enjoying pleasures that neither world offers alone. Harry looked around. His finding ability was going haywire, the room was saturated with magical objects, hidden things, lost things, secrets layered on secrets like geological strata. But he forced himself to focus, to look past the spectacle to the structure beneath. He saw it almost immediately. The Muggle patrons, the ones without magic, had a particular look. A glassy contentment, a softness around the eyes, the expression of people experiencing something too perfect to be natural. They were being manipulated. Not roughly, not the brutal compulsion Harry had forsworn, but subtly, continuously, their emotions nudged toward pleasure and satisfaction and a deep, dreamlike compliance. And in the gambling room, the stakes weren't money. The wizards were wagering objects, a locket that hummed with stored memories, a ring that threw shadows in the wrong direction, a small glass sphere that contained what looked like liquid silver. Magical artifacts, being traded like chips in a casino. You're drugging them, Harry said. Not a question. He was looking at a Muggle woman seated near the window. She was in her 50s, well-dressed, expensive jewelry, the kind of person who'd be at a charity gala. Her drink sat untouched on the table beside her, but her eyes had the same glazed contentment as the others. The air. You've got something in the air. A potion, aerosolized. Knott's eyebrows rose. You can tell. I can feel it. Trying to work on me. It was, a gentle, insistent pressure against his mind, urging relaxation, trust, openness. Harry's raw power was holding it at bay, but the effort was like walking into a strong wind. Euphoria compound. Elara told me about these. They're classified as controlled substances by the Ministry. The Ministry, Not said, and the word carried a weight of contempt so refined it was almost elegant. The Ministry hides in its hole and pretends the Muggle world doesn't exist. Meanwhile, that world grows louder, larger, more powerful by the year. 6 billion Muggles, Harry. 6 billion, and the wizarding world, what, 50,000 in Britain. 100,000. We're outnumbered 60,000 to 1, and our response is to hide behind a statute written 3 centuries ago by frightened men. He guided Harry to a quiet corner, away from the other patrons. They sat across from each other in leather chairs, and Not leaned forward with the intensity of someone sharing a vision. I'm not hiding, Not said. I'm adapting. The Muggle world has resources, money, infrastructure. The wizarding world has power. I'm building a bridge between them. Yes, I use potions. Yes, I trade in artifacts. Yes, I operate outside the Ministry's rules. Because the Ministry's rules are a cage, Harry. A cage built by people too afraid to see what's possible. What you're doing isn't a bridge. It's a farm. You're farming Muggles for money and wizards for artifacts. I'm providing a service. Everyone in this room is here by choice. Choice. Harry looked at the woman by the window again. She was smiling at nothing, her fingers trailing through the air as if touching something invisible. She doesn't look like someone making choices. She looks like someone who's forgotten she has any. Not followed his gaze. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air between them, a subtle rearrangement of the magnetic field of the conversation. You're young, Not said. And you have principles. I admire that. Principles are useful, they give you a frame, a structure to build on. But eventually, you'll learn what I learned, principles are also chains. They bind you to a version of the world that doesn't exist. The real world runs on power, who has it, who uses it, who lets it go to waste. He paused. You have more raw power than any wizard I've encountered in 20 years. More than some Death Eaters I served with. Certainly more than the ministry bureaucrats who'd love to put a leash on you. You're wasting it on property deals and corporate structures. You could be doing so much more. Like what? Like what I'm doing. But bigger. Better. Without the, how did you put it, farming. A true partnership between magical and muggle, with us at the center. Not hiding. Not pretending. Using magic openly, for profit, for progress. Imagine what your finding ability could do if you weren't constrained by muggle laws and wizarding cowardice. You could find anything, Harry. Anything in the world. Lost treasures, hidden resources, buried technologies. Governments would pay fortunes for what you can do. Nations would. The offer hung in the air, shimmering with possibility. And Harry, sitting in this improbable room, surrounded by floating candles and enchanted roulette wheels and the soft haze of a euphoria potion he could barely feel, understood why Cyrus Knott was truly dangerous. Not because of his magic. Not because of his criminal network. Because he was right. About some of it. The statute of secrecy was a cage. The ministry was hiding. The potential for magical muggle cooperation was vast and untapped. Knott saw the world clearly, and his vision was seductive precisely because it contained so much truth. The lie was in the details. In the woman by the window. In the glazed eyes and the stolen choices and the casual, elegant cruelty of a man who decided that his vision mattered more than the people inside it. Harry stood up. No, he said. Knott's expression didn't change. But the temperature in the room dropped by 2 degrees, and the floating candles flickered. Think carefully, Harry. I have. The answer is no. I won't partner with you. I won't join you. And I won't pretend that what you're doing here is anything other than what it is. And what is it? The same thing every powerful person does when they stop seeing other people as people. You've convinced yourself that your goals justify your methods. That the vision excuses the violence. My uncle thought the same way. He thought keeping a child in a cupboard was justified because the child was a freak who didn't deserve better. Harry held Knott's gaze. You're better dressed and better spoken, but you're the same thing he was. A bully with a rationale. The silence that followed was the most dangerous silence Harry had ever stood inside. He could feel Knott's magic shifting, the disciplined control fraying at the edges, heat building behind the cold surface like magma beneath ice. For a moment, Harry genuinely believed he was about to die. Then Knott smiled. It was a different smile than before, thinner, harder, a blade being shown before it was sheathed. You're brave, Knott said. Foolish, but brave. Those are often the same thing at your age. He stood, buttoning his coat with precise, deliberate movements. I offered you partnership. You declined. That's your right. But London isn't big enough for 2 wizards with ambitions, Harry. One of us is going to have to bend. It won't be me. No, Knott said softly. I don't suppose it will. Which means we have a problem. He turned to go, then paused. One more thing. You've been building wards around your properties. Impressive work, as I said. But wards are walls, and walls only work if there's nothing inside them that wants to get out. You might want to check your foundations. You've been building on older ground than you know. He walked away through the club and vanished through a door that closed behind him and ceased to exist, leaving a blank wall. The euphoria in the air intensified momentarily, a parting shot, a reminder of power, and then faded as Harry pushed it away with a surge of will that made his nose bleed. He found his way out through a service corridor that the finding led him to, emerging into a Mayfair alley at midnight. The cold air hit his face and he leaned against the wall and breathed and shook and was, for 30 seconds, just a 9-year-old boy who'd walked into a predator's den and walked out again and was only now realizing how close he'd come to not walking out at all. Then the 30 seconds passed and he wiped the blood from his upper lip and straightened up and started walking home. He had work to do. The war started the next morning. Not with an explosion or a dramatic gesture. With a phone call. Thomas picked up the receiver at 8 a.m. and listened for 30 seconds and put it down with a face like chalk. "The Rotherhithe building," he said. "The studio complex. It's been condemned." "What?" "Council inspectors arrived this morning. They've found structural failures throughout the building. Load-bearing walls cracked. Foundation subsidence. The whole structure is unsafe. They've evacuated the tenants and sealed the site." Harry was on his feet. "That building is sound. I reinforced every wall myself. The foundations are, I know, Harry. I know. But the inspectors have photographs. Documentation. Test results. And it's not just Rotherhithe." Thomas's hand was trembling. "I've had 2 more calls. The Bermondsey units are showing damp that shouldn't be there. And the Deptford conversion, the sellers are claiming fraud. Saying the contracts were falsified. 3 properties. 3 attacks. Simultaneous, coordinated, designed to cause maximum damage to Blackstone's reputation and finances. This wasn't testing anymore. This was war." Harry reached out with the finding, pushing it hard, extending his awareness across the city toward his properties, and felt it immediately. Knott's magic, no longer subtle or hidden, was draped over the Rotherhithe building like a shroud. The structural failures were illusions, magical projections so sophisticated that they fooled instruments and human eyes alike. The building was fine. But the inspectors believed it was failing, and belief was all that mattered in the Muggle world. "I need to get to Rotherhithe," Harry said. "Now." "You can't. It's a sealed site. Council security, Thomas. I need to fix this." "How? How do you fix a building that looks condemned to every inspector who walks through the door? What are you going to do, wave your hands and—" He stopped. Looked at Harry. Harry looked back. "That's exactly what you're going to do," Thomas said. "Yes. Harry, you can't keep, this isn't sustainable. You can't solve every problem with—" He stopped again. Ran his hand over his face. "I need a drink." The words fell into the room like a dropped glass. Thomas heard himself say them and went still. Harry went still. They looked at each other across the desk and the air between them was fragile with something that had nothing to do with magic or business or property. "No, you don't," Harry said. His voice was very quiet. "I know I don't. But I want one. I want one very badly, Harry. And I've wanted one every day for 11 months and I haven't told you because you have enough on your plate and I didn't want to be another problem you had to solve. You're not a problem. I am, though. I'm a recovering alcoholic running a fraudulent company for a child wizard while a dark wizard attacks our buildings with invisible magic. This is not," he laughed, a short, desperate sound. "This is not what I pictured when I imagined getting my life back together." Harry stood. He walked around the desk and stood in front of Thomas and looked up at him, way up, because Thomas was tall and Harry was still small for his age, still carrying the physical legacy of years of deprivation, and said the thing he'd been afraid to say for months. "I need you. Not as a front man. Not as a signature on documents. I need you." Thomas Ashworth. The person. And I'm sorry I've been treating you like a tool instead of a person. You're the closest thing to a father I've ever had, and I've been too stupid and too scared to say it. Thomas's face did something complicated. His jaw worked. His eyes shone. He sat down heavily in his chair and put his hands flat on the desk and breathed. Well, he said. That's rather a lot to process. Take your time. I don't want to drink anymore. Good. I want to cry. That's okay too. Thomas laughed again, but it was a different laugh, wet and shaky and real. You're 9 years old and you're managing my emotional state. That's not right. Nothing about my life is right. I'm working with what I've got. They sat together in the office while the morning light grew stronger and the phone rang twice more problems, more attacks, more damage, and neither of them answered it. For 10 minutes, the empire could wait. For 10 minutes, they were just two people who needed each other and had finally said so. Then Harry picked up the phone and started making calls, and the war continued. Fixing the Rotherhithe building took 3 nights. Harry went in after dark, slipping past the council's security cordon with the unnoticing wrapped tight, and worked through the small hours dismantling Knott's illusions. It was the hardest magical work he'd ever done. Knott's spells were layered, peel away one illusion and there was another beneath it, and another beneath that. Some were keyed to specific triggers, a spell that would reactivate the moment an inspector touched a particular wall, another that would generate new cracks if the building was exposed to rain. It was intricate, malicious, and brilliant, the work of a master craftsman who understood both magic and architecture. Harry fought it with raw power and stubbornness and a growing understanding of magical theory that came from Alara's lessons and his own relentless analysis. He couldn't match Knott's finesse, but he could match his strength, and more. When he poured everything into a counter-ward, the building's own structure responded. The Victorian bricks vibrated under his hands. The iron beams hummed. The building wanted to be whole, and Harry's magic gave it permission. By the 3rd night, the illusions were gone. The building was clean. The council's follow-up inspection found no trace of the structural failures, and the condemnation was lifted with embarrassed apologies. The Bermondsey damp took another 2 nights. The Deptford fraud claim collapsed when Thomas presented the original contracts, genuine, verified, with the seller's signature confirmed by independent analysis. 3 battles. 3 victories. But each one cost Harry days of work, sleep, and magical energy. He was burning through his reserves at an unsustainable rate, and Knott could afford to keep attacking. He had the advantage of initiative, choosing when and where to strike, while Harry could only react. He needed a better strategy. And he needed allies. Maggie was the first person he told everything. The full truth, not the edited version, not the business language version, but everything. Who he was. What he was. Voldemort, Hogwarts, Knott, the ley lines, the undertow, all of it. They sat in the basement office at midnight with the map of London spread between them, ley lines pulsing faintly in enchanted ink, and Harry talked for 2 hours and Maggie listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. The ley lines, she said finally. Show me. Harry touched the map. The lines flared, golden channels flowing beneath the streets, converging at nodes scattered across the city. He pointed to the major junctions, one beneath St. Paul's, one beneath the tower, one under an unmarked location south of the river. That one, Maggie said, pointing to the southern node. That's under the Rotherhithe building. Close to it. Within a few hundred meters. So when Knott attacked that building, he was attacking near a ley line junction. Yes. And the weird stuff, the cold spots, the shadows in the photographs, the thing in the walls, that started before Knott's attack. Harry looked at her. She was connecting dots he'd been too close to see. The building was already affected, Maggie said. The old magic, the undertow, it was already responding to your magic in that area. Knott's attack didn't just damage your building. It disturbed something that was already disturbed. Harry stared at the map. She was right. The Rotherhithe Junction had been showing signs of activity since August, the cold spots, the anomalous shadows. His wards had been containing it, but Knott's assault had disrupted those wards, and the underlying disturbance had bled through. "I've been so focused on Knott that I forgot about the bigger problem," Harry said. "Story of every war ever. You fight the enemy in front of you and the one behind you stabs you in the back." Maggie leaned forward. "Harry. What happens if the undertow thing, what happens if it really wakes up?" "I don't know. Guess." Harry thought about the vision he'd had, the river of light, the pulsing nodes, the vast presence beneath the city. He thought about the frost face in the tube tunnel and the symbols on walls that made people forget their own names. "It's an immune response," he said slowly. Ilara's theory. London has been accumulating magical energy for 2,000 years, Roman wards, Celtic sacred sites, medieval enchantments, all layered on top of each other. It's not conscious, exactly. More like, reflexive. Like a body fighting an infection. And the infection is you. The infection is disruption. Any disruption. My magic, Knott's magic, anything that disturbs the balance. If it fully activates, what? Earthquakes? Floods? What does a magical immune response look like? I think it looks like reality coming apart at the seams. The barriers between what's possible and what isn't getting thin. Magic bleeding through into the mundane world uncontrolled. Maggie was quiet again. Then she said, "Right. So we've got a dark wizard attacking your business, a billionaire trying to expose you, an ancient magical force waking up under our feet, and you're 9. That's about the size of it." "Great." She picked up a pen and pulled the map toward her. "So let's plan." They planned. Maggie's strategic mind, honed by 2 years of survival logistics and network management, complemented Harry's in ways he hadn't expected. Where he thought in terms of assets and leverage, she thought in terms of people and territory. Where he saw problems to be solved, she saw communities to be protected. Together, they mapped Knott's known operations, identified vulnerable Blackstone properties, and designed a warning system using Maggie's street network to detect magical disturbances in real time. "My kids can't see magic," Maggie pointed out. "But they can see the effects. Cold spots. Flickering lights. People acting strange. I'll brief them on what to look for. You're turning a network of homeless children into an early warning system against dark magic. I'm using the resources I have. Isn't that what you taught me?" Harry smiled. It was a real smile, not the businessman smile, not the confident mask. The real one, rare and crooked and genuine. "When did you get so smart?" "I was always this smart. You were just too busy being a genius to notice." November ground into December. London bundled itself in grey wool and cold rain and the particular form of seasonal depression that the English treat as a personality trait. Harry warded his properties, fought Knott's attacks, studied with Ilara, managed Blackstone's operations, and slept approximately 4 hours a night. The housing development nearly broke him. It was supposed to be Blackstone's signature project, the transformation of a disused industrial estate in Deptford into a mixed-use development. Residential, commercial, community space. Harry had identified the site 6 months ago, feeling the pull of its potential like a heartbeat. This was a place that wanted to be something, and he could feel what it wanted to be. Housing. Real housing, not the luxury boxes that developers like Hargrove built for foreign investors who'd never live in them. Housing for people. Families. Communities. The financial projections were extraordinary. The site was undervalued, the council was eager for development, and the transport links were about to improve dramatically. Build it right and it would be worth a fortune. But, building it right meant displacing the people already there. Harry hadn't realized this initially. The industrial estate was supposed to be empty, disused, abandoned, the kind of dead space that cities accumulate like scar tissue. But Maggie's network told a different story. The estate wasn't empty. It was home to a community of squatters, pensioners, immigrants, single parents, people who'd fallen through every safety net the system was supposed to provide and had built their own. Small businesses operated from converted units, a tailor, a mechanic, a woman who sold home-cooked meals from a kitchen she'd built from salvaged materials. They've been there for years, Maggie said. She was standing in the estate with Harry on a wet December morning, watching a man hang washing on a line strung between two buildings. Some of them for longer than I've been alive. They've built something here, Harry. It's not pretty and it's not legal, but it's theirs. Harry looked at the man hanging washing. Looked at the windows of the converted units, some with curtains, some with plants on the sills. Looked at the community